BFG by Roald Dahl. Sophie couldn't sleep. A brilliant moonbeam was slanting through a gap in the curtains. It was shining right onto her pillow. The other children in the dormitory had been asleep for hours. The house was absolutely silent. No voices from downstairs, no footsteps on the floor above either. The window behind the curtain was wide open, but nobody was walking on the pavement outside. Not the tiniest sound could be heard anywhere. Sophie had never known such a silence. Perhaps, she told herself, this was what they called the witching hour, when every child and every grown-up was in a deep, deep sleep, and all the dark things came out from hiding and had the world to themselves. The moonbeam was brighter than ever on Sophie's pillow. She decided to get out of bed and close the gap in the curtains. She reached out for her glasses that lay on the chair beside her bed. They had steel rims with very thick lenses, and she could hardly see a thing without them. She put them on. Then she slipped out of bed and tiptoed over to the window. When she reached the curtains, Sophie hesitated. She longed to see what the world looked like now that the witching hour was at hand. She listened again. Everywhere was deathly still. Quickly she ducked under the curtains and leaned out of the window. In the silvery moonlight, the village street she knew so well seemed completely different. The houses looked bent and crooked. Everything was pale and ghostly and milky white. Across the road she could see Mrs. Rance's shop, where you bought buttons and wools and bits of elastic. There was something dim and misty about that, too. Sophie allowed her eye to travel further and further down the street. Suddenly she froze. There was something coming up the street on the opposite side. It was something black. Something tall and black. Something very tall and very black and very thin. It wasn't a human. It couldn't be. It was 4 times as tall as the tallest human. It was so tall its head was higher than the upstairs windows of the houses. Sophie opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. This was the witching hour, all right. The tall black figure was coming her way. On and on it came, nearer and nearer, but it was moving in spurts. It would stop, then it would move on, then it would stop again. But what on earth was it doing? Aha! Sophie could see now what it was up to. It would stop and peer into the upstairs window of each house in the street. It actually had to bend down to peer into the upstairs windows. That's how tall it was. It was much closer now, and Sophie could see it more clearly. Looking at it carefully, she decided it had to be some kind of person. Obviously, it was not a human, but it was definitely a person. A giant person, perhaps. Sophie stared hard across the misty moonlit street. The giant, if that was what he was wearing a long black cloak. In one hand, he was holding what looked like a very long, thin trumpet. In the other hand, he held a large suitcase. The giant had stopped now right in front of Mr. and Mrs. Gucci's house. The Guccis had a greengrocer's shop in the middle of the high street, and the family lived above the shop. The giant was peering through the window into the room where Michael and Jane Gucci were sleeping. From across the street, Sophie watched and held her breath. She saw the giant step back a pace and put the suitcase down on the pavement. He took something out of it. It looked like a glass jar, one of those square ones with a screw top. He unscrewed the top of the jar and poured what was in it into the end of the long trumpet thing. Sophie watched, trembling. She saw the giant straighten up again, and she saw him poke the trumpet in through the open upstairs window of the room where the Gucci children were sleeping. She saw the giant take a deep breath, and woof! He blew through the trumpet. Whatever had been in the jar had now been blown through the trumpet into the Gucci children's bedroom. What could it be? As the giant withdrew the trumpet from the window, he happened to turn his head and glance across the street. In the moonlight, Sophie caught a glimpse of an enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face with the most enormous ears. The nose was as sharp as a knife, and above the nose there were two bright, flashing eyes, and the eyes were staring straight at Sophie. Sophie gave a yelp and pulled back from the window. She flew across the dormitory and jumped into her bed and hid under the blanket. After a minute or so, she lifted a corner and peeped out. There at the window, with the curtains pushed aside, was the enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face of the giant person staring in. The flashing black eyes were fixed on Sophie's bed. The next moment, a huge hand with pale fingers came snaking in through the window. This was followed by an arm as thick as a tree trunk. This time, Sophie really did scream, but only for a second, because very quickly the huge hand clamped down over her blanket and the scream was smothered by the bedclothes. Sophie, crouching underneath the blanket, felt strong fingers grasping hold of her, and then she was lifted up from her bed, blanket and all, and whisked out of the window. When the giant had got Sophie outside, he arranged the blanket so that he could grasp all the four corners of it at once in one of his huge hands, with Sophie imprisoned inside. In the other hand, he seized the suitcase and the long trumpet thing, and off he ran. Sophie, by squirming around inside the blanket, managed to push the top of her head out through a little gap just below the giant's hand. She stared around her. She saw the village houses rushing by on both sides. The giant was sprinting down the high street. Each stride he took was as long as a tennis court. Out of the village he ran, and soon they were racing across the moonlit fields. The hedges dividing the fields were no problem to the giant. He simply strode over them. A wide river appeared in his path. He crossed it in one flying stride. The giant ran on and on. But now a curious change took place in his way of running. Faster and faster he went, and soon he was travelling at such a speed that the landscape became blurred. The wind stung Sophie's cheek. It made her eyes water. It whistled in her ears. She could no longer feel the giant's feet touching the ground. She had a weird sensation they were flying. This giant had some sort of magic in his legs. The wind rushing against Sophie's face became so strong that she had to duck down again into the blanket to prevent her head from being blown away. Was it really possible that they were crossing oceans? It certainly felt that way to Sophie. She crouched in the blanket. The howling of the wind went on for what seemed like hours. Then, all at once, the wind stopped its howling. The pace began to slow down. Sophie could feel the giant's feet pounding once again over the earth. She poked her head out to have a look. They were in a country of thick forests and rushing rivers. The giant had definitely slowed down and was now running more normally, although normal was a silly word to use to describe a galloping giant. He went rattling down into a valley and up over a range of hills, and soon he was galloping over a desolate wasteland that was not quite of this earth. The ground was flat and pale yellow. Great lumps of blue rock were scattered around, and dead trees stood everywhere like skeletons. Sophie, still peering out from the blanket, saw suddenly ahead of her a great craggy mountain. The mountain was dark blue, and all around it the sky was gushing and glistening with light. Bits of pale gold were flying among delicate frosty white flakes of cloud, and over to one side the rim of the morning sun was coming up, red as blood. Right beneath the mountain the giant stopped. He was puffing mightily. Directly in front of them, lying against the side of the mountain, Sophie could see a massive round stone, as big as a house. The giant reached out and rolled the stone to one side, as easily as if it had been a football. Where the stone had been, there appeared a vast black hole. The hole was so large the giant didn't even have to duck his head as he went in. As soon as he was inside, he stopped and turned and rolled the great stone back into place. Sophie felt herself being lowered to the ground. Then the giant let go of the blanket completely. His footsteps moved away. Sophie sat there in the dark, shivering with fear. "He is getting ready to eat me," she told herself. "He will probably eat me raw, just as I am." A blaze of light suddenly lit up the whole place. Sophie blinked and stared. She saw an enormous cavern with a high rocky pool. The walls on either side were lined with shelves, and on the shelves there stood row upon row of glass jars. There were jars everywhere. They were piled up in the corners. They filled every nook and cranny. In the middle of the floor there was a table 12 feet high and a chair to match. The giant took off his black cloak and hung it against the wall. Sophie saw that under the cloak he was wearing a sort of collarless shirt with a dirty old leather waistcoat that didn't seem to have any buttons. His trousers were faded green and were far too short in the legs. On his bare feet he was wearing a pair of ridiculous sandals that for some reason had holes cut along each side, with a large hole at the end where his toes stuck out. Sophie gazed at him through thick steel-rimmed glasses. She was trembling like a leaf in the wind, and a finger of ice was running up and down the length of her spine.
"Oh!"
shouted the giant, walking forward and rubbing his hands together.
"What has this got here?"
His booming voice rolled around the walls of the cave like a burst of thunder. The giant picked up the trembling Sophie with one hand and carried her across the cave and put her on the table. "Now he really is going to eat me," Sophie thought. The giant had truly enormous ears. Each one was as big as the wheel of a truck, and he seemed to be able to move them inwards and outwards from his head as he wished.
"I is hungry,"
the giant boomed. He grinned, showing massive square teeth. The teeth were very white. They sat in his mouth like huge slices of white bread. "Please don't eat me," Sophie stammered. The giant let out a bellow of laughter.
"Just because I is a giant, you think I is a man-gobbling cannibal. You is about right. Giants is all cannibal is murderful, and they just gobble up human beings. We is in giant country now. Giants is everywhere around. Out there us has the famous bone-crunching giant. Bone-crunching giant crunches up 2 wopsy-whiffling human beings for supper every night. Noise is ear-bursting. Noise of crunching bones goes crackety-crack for miles around.
Ouch!
Bone-crunching giant only gobbles human beings from Turkey.
Why Turks?
Bone Cruncher says Turkish human beings has a glamourly flavour. He says Turks from Turkey is tasting of turkey.
I suppose they would.
Of course they would. Every human being is diddly and different. Some is scrumdiddly-umptious, and some is ucky-slush. Greeks is all full of ucky-slush. No giant is eating Greeks, ever.
Why not?
Greeks is all tasting greasy.
I imagine that's possible too, Sophie said. She was wondering with a bit of a tremble what all this talking about eating people was leading up to.
As I am saying,
the giant went on,
all human beings is having different flavours. Human beings from Panama is tasting very strong of hats.
Why hats?
You is not very clever,
the giant said, moving his great ears in and out.
I thought all human beings is full of brains, but your head is emptier than a bundongle.
Do you like vegetables? Sophie asked, hoping to steer the conversation towards a slightly less dangerous kind of food.
You is trying to change the subject,
the giant said sternly.
We is having an interesting babblement about the taste of the human being. The human being is not a vegetable.
Oh, but the bean is a vegetable.
Not the human being. The human being has 2 legs, and a vegetable has no legs at all.
Sophie didn't argue any more.
The human being,
the giant went on,
is coming in dillions of different flavours. For instance, human beans from Wales is tasting very whooshy of fish. There is something very fishy about Wales.
You mean Wales, Sophie said. Wales is something quite different.
Wales is Wales. Don't gobble-funk around with words. I will now give you another example. Danes from Denmark is tasting ever so much of dogs.
Of course, Great Danes.
Wrong,
cried the giant, slapping his thigh.
Danes from Denmark is tasting of Labradors.
Then what do the people of Labrador taste of?
Danes.
The giant cried triumphantly. Aren't you getting a bit mixed up? Sophie asked.
I is a very mixed-up giant, but I does do my best, and I is not nearly as mixed up as the other giants. I know one who gallops all the way to Wellington for his supper.
What do the people of Wellington taste of? Sophie asked.
Boots.
Of course, Sophie said. I should have known. Sophie decided that this conversation had now gone on long enough. If she was going to be eaten, she'd rather get it over and done with right away than be kept hanging around any more. What sort of human beings do you eat? She asked, trembling.
Me?
Shouted the giant, his mighty voice making the glass jars rattle on their shelves.
Me gobbling up human beings? This I never. I is a freaky giant. I is a nice and jumbly giant. I is the only nice and jumbly giant in giant country. I is the big friendly giant. I is the BFG. What is your name?
My name is Sophie. And if you are so nice and friendly, then why did you snatch me from my bed?
Because you saw me,
the big friendly giant answered.
If anyone is ever seeing a giant, he or she must be taken away hip-switch.
Why? Asked Sophie.
Well, first of all, human beings is not really believing in giants, is they? Human beings is not thinking we exist.
I do.
Ah, but that is only because you have seen me,
cried the BFG.
I cannot possibly allow anyone, even little girls, to be seeing me and staying at home. The first thing you would be doing, you would be scuttling around yodeling the news that you were actually seeing a giant. And then a great giant hunt, a mighty giant look-see, will be starting up all over the world. People will be rushing and bushing after me with goodness knows what, and they would be catching me and putting me into the zoo or the bunkum house with all those squiggling hippodumplings and crocodile dillies.
Sophie knew that what the giant said was true.
I will bet you,
the BFG went on,
that you would have been splashing the news all over the wonky world, wouldn't you, if I hadn't wiggled you away?
I suppose I would.
And that would never do.
So what will happen to me now? Sophie asked.
If you do go back, you will be telling the world. Most likely on the telly bunkum box and the radio squeaker. So you will just have to be staying here with me for the rest of your life.
Oh, no, cried Sophie.
Oh, yes. But I am warning you not ever to go whiffling about out of this cave without I is with you, or you will be coming to an ucky-mucky end.
The big friendly giant picked Sophie off the table and carried her to the cave entrance. He rolled the huge stone to one side and said,
Peep out over there, little girl, and tell me what you is seeing.
The sun was up now and shining fiery hot over the great yellow wasteland, with its blue rocks and dead trees. Saw several tremendous tall figures moving among the rocks about 500 yards away. 3 or 4 others were sitting quite motionless on the rocks themselves. It was a brain-boggling sight. The giants were all naked except for a sort of short skirt around their waists, and their skins were burnt brown by the sun. But it was the sheer size of each one of them that boggled Sophie's brain most of all. They were simply colossal, far taller and wider than the big friendly giant upon whose hand she was now sitting. And oh, how ugly they were. What on earth are they doing? Sophie asked.
Nothing. They is just moochling and footling around and waiting for the night to come. Then they will all be galloping off to places where people is living to find their suppers.
Do they ever go to England? Sophie asked.
Often. They say the English is tasting ever so wonderfully of crotts-collop.
Oh, I'm not sure I quite know what that means.
Meanings is not important. I cannot be right all the time. Quite often I is left instead of right.
And are all those beastly giants over there really going off again tonight to eat people? Sophie asked.
All of them, every night.
The BFG answered.
All of them excepting me. That is why you will be coming to an ucky-mucky end if any of them should ever be getting his gogglers upon you.
But eating people is horrible, Sophie cried. Why doesn't somebody stop them?
And who, please, is going to be stopping them?
Asked the BFG. Couldn't you?
Never in a pig's whistle. All of those man-eating giants is enormous and very fierce. They is all at least 2 times my wideness and double my royal highness.
Twice as high as you.
Easily that. You is seeing them in the distance, but just wait till you get them close up. Those giants is all at least 50 feet tall, with huge muscles and cockles alive-o. I is the titchy one. I is the rut.
Back in the cave, the big friendly giant sat Sophie down once again on the enormous table.
I cannot help thinking about your poor mother and father. By now they must be jipping and scumping all over the house, shouting, "Hello, hello, where is Sophie gone?"
I don't have a mother and father. They both died when I was a baby.
Oh, you poor little scrumplet. Is you not missing them very badly?
Not really, because I never knew them. That place you took me from was the village orphanage. We are all orphans in there.
You is an orphan?
Yes.
How many is there in there?
10 of us, all little girls.
Was you happy there?
The BFG asked. I hated it. The woman who ran it was called Mrs. Cronkers, and if she caught you breaking any of the rules, you got punished.
How is you getting punished?
She locked us in the dark cellar for a day and a night without anything to eat or drink.
The rotten old rock rasper.
It was horrid.
The filthy old face wiggler. That is the horridest thing I was hearing for years.
All at once, a huge tear that would have filled a bucket rolled down one of the BFG's cheeks and fell with a splash on the floor. It made quite a puddle. Sophie watched with astonishment. What a strange creature this is, she thought. The thing that worries me is having to stay in this dreadful place for the rest of my life. The orphanage was pretty awful, but I wouldn't have been there forever, would I?
All is my fault. I is the one who kid-snatched you.
Yet another enormous tear welled from his eye and splashed onto the floor. For a few moments the cave was silent. Then Sophie said, "May I ask you a question?" The BFG wiped the tears from his eyes with the back of his hand.
Shoot away.
Would you please tell me what you were doing in our village last night? Why were you poking that long trumpet thing into the Gucci children's bedroom?
Ah! Now we're getting nosier than a Parker.
And the suitcase you were carrying. What on earth was that all about?
You is asking me to tell you whoopsie big secrets.
I won't tell a soul. I swear it. How could I anyway? I'm stuck here for the rest of my life.
You could be telling the other giants.
No, I couldn't. You told me they would eat me up the moment they saw me.
And so they would.
Please tell me what you were doing in our village. I promise you can trust me.
If you is really wanting to know what I am doing in your village, I is blowing a dream into the bedroom of those children.
Blowing a dream? What do you mean?
I is a dream-blowing giant. When all the other giants is galloping off every what way and which to swallow up human beings, I is scuttling away to other places to blow dreams into the bedrooms of sleeping children. Nice dreams. Lovely golden dreams. Dreams that is giving the dreamers a happy time.
Now, hang on a minute. Where do you get these dreams?
I collect them,
the BFG said, waving an arm towards all the rows and rows of bottles on the shelves. You can't collect a dream. A dream isn't something you can catch hold of. The BFG settled himself comfortably in his chair and crossed his legs.
Dreams is very mysterious things. They is floating around in the air like little whipsy misty bubbles.
Can you see them?
Never at first.
Then how do you catch them if you can't see them?
Ah, now we is getting onto the dark and dusky secrets.
He closed his eyes and sat quite still for a moment while Sophie waited.
A dream, as it goes whiffling through the night air, is making a tiny little buzzing humming noise. But this little buzzy hum is so silvery soft, it is impossible for a human being to be hearing it.
Can you hear it? The BFG pointed up at his enormous truck wheel ears, which he now began to move in and out. He performed this exercise with a little proud smile on his face.
Is you seeing these?
How could I miss them?
They is allowing me to hear absolutely every single twiddly little thing.
You mean you could hear things I can't hear?
You is deaf as a dumpling compared with me. You is hearing only thumping loud noises with those little earwigs of yours. But I am hearing all the secret whisperings of the world.
Such as what?
In your country, I is hearing the footsteps of a ladybird as she goes walking across a leaf.
Good gracious me! What else can you hear?
Sometimes, on a very clear night, and if I is swiggling my ears in the right direction.
And here he swiveled his great ears upwards so they were facing the ceiling.
If I is swiggling them like this, and the night is very clear, I is sometimes hearing far-away music coming from the stars in the sky.
A queer little shiver passed through Sophie's body. She sat very quiet, waiting for more.
My ears is what told me you was watching me out of your window last night.
But I didn't make a sound.
I was hearing your heart beating across the road, loud as a drum.
Go on, please.
I can hear plants and trees.
Do they talk?
They is not exactly talking, but they is making noises. For instance, if I come along and I is picking a lovely flower, if I is twisting the stem of the flower till it breaks, then the plant is screaming. I can hear it screaming and screaming very clear.
Is that really true?
You think I is swizfiggling you?
Well, it's rather hard to believe.
Then I is stopping right here,
said the BFG sharply.
I is not wishing to be called a fibster.
Oh, no, I'm not calling you anything. I believe you, I do really. Please go on. The BFG gave her a long, hard stare. Sophie looked right back at him, her face open to his. I believe you, she said softly.
I wouldn't ever be fibbling to you.
I know you wouldn't. But it isn't easy to believe such amazing things straight away.
I understand that.
He waited a while longer, and then he said,
It is the same with trees as it is with flowers. If I is chopping an axe into the trunk of a big tree, I is hearing a terrible sound coming from inside the heart of the tree.
What sort of sound?
A soft moaning sound. It is like the sound an old man is making when he is dying slowly.
He paused. The cave was very silent.
Such wonderful and terrible sounds I is hearing. Some of them you would never wish to be hearing yourself. But some is like glorious music.
He seemed almost to be transfigured by the excitement of his thoughts. Tell me more about them, Sophie said quietly.
You just ought to be hearing the little miceies talking. I is hearing them as loud as my own voice.
What do they say?
Only the miceies know that. Spiders is also talking a great deal. And when they is spinning their webs, they is singing all the time. They is singing sweeter than a nightingale.
What else do you hear?
One of the biggest chat bags is the cattle piddlers.
What do they say?
Ooh, they is arguing all the time about who is going to be the prettiest butterfly. That is all they is ever talking about.
Is there a dream floating around here now? The BFG moved his great ears this way and that, listening intently. He shook his head.
There is no dream in here, except in the bottles. I has a special place to go to for catching dreams. They is not often coming to giant country.
How do you catch them?
The same way you was catching butterflies. With a net.
He stood up and crossed over to a corner of the cave where a pole was leaning against the wall. The pole was about 30 feet long, and there was a net on the end of it.
Here is the dream catcher,
he said, grasping the pole in one hand. Suddenly, he seemed to lose interest in his conversation.
I is getting hungry. It is time for eats.
If you don't eat people like all the others, then what do you live on?
Oh, that is a tricky problem round here. In giant country, happy eats like pineapples and pigwinkles is simply not growing. Nothing is growing except for one extremely icky-poo vegetable. It is called the snoscumber.
The snoscumber? There's no such thing. The BFG looked at Sophie and smiled, showing about 20 of his square white teeth.
Yesterday, we was not believing in giants, was we? Today we is not believing in snoscumbers. I will now show you a snoscumber.
The BFG flung open a massive cupboard and took out the weirdest-looking thing Sophie had ever seen. It was about half as long again as an ordinary man, but was much thicker. It was as thick around its girth as a perambulator. It was black with white stripes along its length, and it was covered all over with coarse knobbles.
Here is the repulsant snoscumber,
cried the BFG, waving it about.
I squoggle it. I despise it. I desponge it. But because I is refusing to gobble up human beings like the other giants, I must spend my life guzzling up icky-poo snoscumbers instead. If I don't, I will be nothing but skin and groans.
You mean skin and bones?
I know it is bones. But please understand that I cannot be helping it if I sometimes is saying things a little squiggly. I is trying my very best all the time.
The big friendly giant looked suddenly so forlorn that Sophie got quite upset. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be rude. The BFG was holding the awesome snoscumber in his right hand, and now he put one end into his mouth and bit off a huge hunk of it. He started crunching it up, and the noise he made was like the crunching of lumps of ice.
It's filthy,
he spluttered, speaking with his mouth full and spraying large pieces of snoscumber like bullets in Sophie's direction.
It's disgustorous,
the BFG gurgled.
Oh, it's sickable, it's rotsome, it's maggot-wise. Try it yourself, this foulsome snoscumber.
No, thank you, Sophie said, backing away.
It's all you're going to be guzzling around here from now on, so you might as well get used to it. Go on, you snipsy little winkle. Have a go.
Sophie took a small nibble. Ah! She spluttered. Oh, no! Oh, gosh, oh, help! She spat it out quickly. It tastes of frog skins, she gasped, and rotten fish.
Worse than that,
cried the BFG, roaring with laughter.
To me, it is tasting of cockroaches and slime wanglers.
Do we really have to eat it?
You do, unless you was wanted to become so thin, you will be disappearing into a thick air.
Into thin air, A thick ear is something quite different. Once again, that sad, winsome look came into the BFG's eyes.
Words is also such a twitch-tickling problem to me all my life. I know exactly what words I'm wanting to say, but somehow or other, they is always getting squiddled around.
Oh, that happens to everyone.
Not like it happens to me. I is speaking the most terrible Wiglish.
I think you speak beautifully.
You do?
Cried the BFG, suddenly brightening.
Oh, you really do?
Simply beautifully.
Well, that is the nicest present anybody has ever given to me in my whole life. Are you sure you is not twiddling my legs?
Of course not. I just love the way you talk.
How wondercrump!
Cried the BFG, still beaming.
How whoopsie splunkers! How absolutely squiffling! Oh, I is all of a stutter.
Suddenly, a tremendous thumping noise came from outside the cave entrance, and a voice like thunder shouted,
Run! Is you there, Run? I is hearing you jabbling. Who is you jabbling to? Run! Look out! It's the blood bottler.
But before he had finished speaking, the stone was rolled aside, and a 50-foot giant, more than twice as tall and wide as the BFG, came striding into the cave. He was naked, except for a dirty little piece of cloth around his bottom. Sophie was on the tabletop. The enormous, partly eaten snoscumber was lying near her. She ducked behind it. The creature came clumping into the cave and stood towering over the BFG.
Who was you jabbling to in here just now?
He boomed.
I is jabbling to myself,
the BFG answered.
Pilful fizz,
shouted the blood bottler.
Bugs wallop. You is talking to a human being. That's what I is thinking. No,
cried the BFG.
Yes.
Boomed the blood bottler.
I is guessing you was snitched away a human being and brought it back to your bunghole as a pet. So, now I is winkling it out and guzzling it as extra snacks before my supper.
The poor BFG was very nervous.
There is no one in here,
he stammered. The blood bottler pointed a finger as large as a tree trunk at the BFG.
Runty little scum-screwer. Piffling little swishfigger. Squimpy little bottlewort. Brunty little pog-swizzer. I is now going to search the primroses.
He grabbed the BFG by the arm.
And you is going to help me do it.
Sophie peered around the chewed-off end of the enormous snoscumber, watching the two giants as they moved away down the cave. The blood bottler was a gruesome sight. His skin was reddish-brown. There was black hair sprouting on his chest and arms and on his stomach. The hair on his head was long and dark and tangled. His foul face was round and squashy-looking. The eyes were tiny black holes. The nose was small and flat, but the mouth was huge. It spread right across the face, almost ear to ear, and it had lips that were like two gigantic purple frankfurters lying one on top of the other. Craggy yellow teeth stuck out between the lips, and rivers of spit ran down over the chin. Soon the blood bottler would be coming back, Sophie told herself, and he was bound to search the tabletop. But she couldn't possibly jump off the table. It was 12 feet high. She'd break a leg. The snoscumber, although it was as thick as a perambulator, was not going to hide her if the blood bottler picked it up. She examined the chewed-off end. It had large seeds in the middle, each one as big as a melon. They were embedded in a soft, slimy stuff. Taking care to stay out of sight, Sophie reached forward and scooped away half a dozen of these seeds. This left a hole in the middle of the snoscumber large enough for her to crouch in. so long as she rolled herself up into a ball. She crawled into it. It was a wet and slimy hiding place, but what did that matter if it was going to save her from being eaten? The blood bottler and the BFG were coming back towards the table now. The BFG was nearly fainting with fear. Suddenly, the blood bottler grabbed the half-eaten snoscumber. The BFG stared at the bare table. "Sophie, where is you?" he thought desperately.
"So this is the filthing rotsome garbage you is eating,"
boomed the blood bottler, holding up the partly eaten snoscumber.
"You must be cockles to be guzzling such rub squash."
For a moment, the blood bottler seemed to have forgotten about his search for Sophie. The BFG decided to lead him further off the track.
"That is the scrumdiddlyumptious snoscumber. I is guzzling it gleefully every night and day. Is you never trying a snoscumber, blood bottler? Human beans is juicier." "You is talking rummy tot,"
the BFG said, growing braver by the second. He was thinking that if only he could get the blood bottler to take one bite of the repulsive vegetable, the sheer foulness of its flavour would send him bellowing out of the cave.
"I is happy to let you sample it,"
the BFG went on.
"But please, when you see how truly glumptious it is, do not be guzzling the whole thing."
Sophie, crouching inside the chewed-off end, began to tremble all over.
"You is not switch-fiddling me, is you?" "Never,"
cried the BFG passionately.
"Oh, take a bite, and I am positive you will be shouting out how scrumdiddlyumptious this wonder veg is." "Just this once. I is going to taste these rotsome eats of yours, but I is warning you that if it is filthsome, I is smashing it over your sludgy little head."
He picked up the snoscumber. He began raising it on its long journey to his mouth, some 50 feet up in the air. Sophie wanted to scream, "Don't!" but that would have been an even more certain death. Crouching among the slimy seeds, she felt herself being lifted up and up and up. Suddenly there was a crunch as the blood bottler bit a huge hunk off the end. Sophie saw his yellow teeth clamping together a few inches from her head. Then there was utter darkness. She was in his mouth. She caught a whiff of his evil-smelling breath. It stank of bad meat. She waited for the teeth to go crunch once more. She prayed that she would be killed quickly. Roared the blood bottler. And then he spat. All of the great lumps of snoscumber that were in his mouth, as well as Sophie herself, went shooting out across the cave. If Sophie had struck the stony wall of the cave, she would most certainly have been killed. Instead, she hit the soft folds of the BFG's black cloak hanging against the wall. She dropped to the ground, half stunned. She crawled under the hem of the cloak, and there she crouched.
"You little swine bugler!"
roared the blood bottler.
"You little pig swiller!"
He rushed at the BFG and smashed what was left of the snoscumber over his head. Fragments of the filthy vegetable splashed all over the cave.
"You is not loving it?"
the BFG asked innocently, rubbing his head.
"Loving it?"
yelled the blood bottler.
"That is the most disgusting taste that is ever touching my teeth. You must be buggles to be swallowing sludge like that. Every night you could be galloping off happy as a hamburger and gobbling juicy human beans." "Eating human beings is wrong and evil." "It is guzzly and glumptious,"
shouted the blood bottler.
"And tonight I is galloping off to Chile to swabble a few human chili beans." "Horrible. You ought to be ashamed." "Other giants is all saying they is wanting to gallop off to England tonight to guzzle school chittlers. I is very fond indeed of English school chittlers. They has a nice inky booky flavour. Perhaps I will change my mind and go to England with them. You is disgusting. And you is an insult to the giant peoples. You is not fit to be a giant. You is a squinky little pipsqueak. You is a cream puff nut.
With that, the blood-bottling giant strode out of the cave. The BFG ran to the cave entrance and quickly rolled the stone back into place.
Sophie,
he whispered.
Sophie? Where is you, Sophie?
Sophie emerged from under the hem of the black cloak. I'm here. The BFG picked her up and held her tenderly in the palm of his hand.
Oh, I is so happy to be finding you all in one lump.
I was in his mouth.
You was what?
Sophie told him what had happened.
Oh, just look at you, you poor little chiddler. You was all covered in snoscumber and giant spit.
He set about cleaning her up as best he could.
Oh, I is hating those other giants more than ever now. You know what I should like?
What? Sophie said.
I should like to find a way of disappearing them. Every single one.
And I'd be glad to help you, Sophie said. By now, Sophie was beginning to feel very thirsty. May I please have a little water?
Water?
Said the BFG, frowning mightily.
What is water?
We drink it. What do you drink?
Frobscottle,
announced the BFG.
All giants is drinking frobscottle.
He got up from his chair and went to a second huge cupboard. He opened it and took out a glass bottle that must have been 6 feet tall. The liquid inside it was pale green, and the bottle was half full.
Here is frobscottle,
he cried, holding the bottle up.
Delumptious frobscottle.
He gave it a shake, and the green stuff began to fizz like mad. But look, it's fizzing the wrong way, Sophie cried. And indeed it was. The bubbles, instead of travelling upwards and bursting on the surface, were shooting downwards and bursting at the bottom.
What on earth you meaning, the wrong way?
In our fizzy drinks, the bubbles always go up and burst at the top.
Upwards is the wrong way. You mustn't be having the bubbles going upwards. That's the most flush-bunking rubbish I ever is hearing.
Why shouldn't the bubbles go upwards?
I will explain. But tell me first, what name is you calling your frobscottle by?
One is Coke, another is Pepsi. There are lots of them.
And the bubbles is all going up?
They all go up.
Catastrous. Upgoing bubbles is a catastrous dystrophy.
Will you please tell me why?
If you will listen carefully, I will try to explain.
I'll do my best.
Very well, then. When you is drinking this cokey drink of yours, it is going straight down into your tummy. Is that right? Or is it left?
It's right.
And the bubbles is going also into your tummy. Right or left?
Right again.
And the bubbles is fizzing upwards.
Of course.
Which means that they will all come swish-swiffling up your throat and out of your mouth and make a foulsome, belchy burp.
That is often true.
Burping is filthsome. Us giants is never doing it.
But with your drink, what was it you called it?
Frobscottle.
With frobscottle, the bubbles in your tummy will be going downwards, and that could have a far nastier result.
Why nasty?
Because, Sophie said, blushing a little, if they go down instead of up, they will be coming out somewhere else with an even louder and ruder noise.
A whiz-popper!
Cried the BFG, beaming at her.
Us giants is making whiz-poppers all the time. You surely is not telling me that a little whiz-popping is forbidden among human beings?
It is considered extremely rude.
But you is whiz-popping, is you not? Now and again.
Well, everyone is whiz-popping, if that's what you call it. But where I come from, it is not polite to talk about it.
Redunculous. If everyone is making whiz-poppers, then why not talk about it?
The BFG shook the bottle vigorously. The pale green stuff fizzed and bubbled. He removed the cork and took a tremendous gurgling swig.
It's glummy. Oh, I love it.
For a few moments, the big friendly giant stood quite still, and a look of absolute ecstasy began to spread over his long, wrinkly face. Then suddenly he let fly with a series of the loudest and rudest noises Sophie had ever heard in her life. They reverberated round the walls of the cave like thunder, and the glass jars rattled on their shelves. But most astonishing of all, the force of the explosions actually lifted the giant clear off his feet like a rocket.
Whoopee!
He cried when he came down to earth again.
Now that is whiz-popping for you.
Sophie burst out laughing. She couldn't help it.
Have some yourself,
cried the BFG, tipping the neck of the enormous bottle towards her. Sophie opened her mouth, and very gently the BFG poured some of the fabulous frobscottle down her throat. And oh, gosh, how delicious it was! It was sweet and refreshing. It tasted of vanilla and cream with just the faintest trace of raspberries. And the bubbles were wonderful. Sophie could actually feel them bouncing and bursting all around her tummy. It felt as though hundreds of tiny people were dancing a jig inside her and tickling her with their toes. "It's lovely!" she cried.
Just wait.
Sophie could feel the bubbles travelling lower and lower down her tummy, and then suddenly, inevitably, the explosion came. The trumpet sounded, and she too made the walls of the cavern ring with the sound of music and thunder.
Bravo!
Shouted the BFG, waving the bottle.
Oh, you is very good for a beginner.
The BFG strode across the cave and picked up his dream-catching net.
I is galloping off now to catch some more wopsy-whiffling dreams for my collection. Is you wishing to come with me?
Not me, thank you very much. Not with those other giants lurking outside.
I is snuggling you very cosy into the pocket of my waistcoat. Then no one is seeing you.
Before Sophie could protest, he had picked her up off the table and popped her into his waistcoat pocket.
Is you wishing for a little hole to peep out from?
There's one here already, she said. She had found a small hole in the pocket, and when she put one eye close to it, she could see out very well indeed. She watched the BFG as he bent down and filled his suitcase with empty glass jars. He closed the lid, picked up the suitcase in one hand, took the pole with the net on the end in the other hand, and marched towards the entrance of the cave. As soon as he was outside, the BFG set off across the great hot yellow wasteland, where the blue rocks lay and the dead trees stood, and where all the other giants were skulking about. Sophie, squatting low on her heels in the pocket of the leather waistcoat, had one eye glued to the little hole. She saw the group of enormous giants about 300 yards ahead.
Hold your breath,
the BFG whispered down to her.
Cross your figglers. Here we go. Is you seen that whopping great one, the one nearest to us?
I see him, Sophie whispered back, quivering.
That is the horriblest of them all, and the biggest of them all. He is called the flesh-lump-eating giant.
I don't want to hear about him.
He is 54 feet high,
the BFG said softly as he jogged along.
And he is swallowing human beings like they are sugar lumps, 2 or 3 at a time.
You're making me nervous.
I is nervous myself. I always gets as jumpsy as a joghopper when the flesh-lump-eating giant is around.
Keep away from him.
Not possible. He is galloping easily 2 times as quickly as me.
Through her little peephole, Sophie saw the flesh-lump-eating giant move over to intercept them. He didn't hurry. He just loped over casually to a point where the BFG would have to pass. The others loped after him. Sophie counted 9 of them altogether, and she recognized the blood bottler in the middle of them.
Here comes the runty one,
boomed the flesh-lump-eater.
Ho, ho there, runty one. Where is you sprat winkling away to in such a hefty hurry?
He shot out an enormous arm and grabbed the BFG by the hair. The BFG didn't struggle. he simply stopped and stood quite still and said,
"Be so kind as to be letting go of my hair, Flesh Lump Eater."
The Flesh Lump Eater released him and stepped back a pace. The other giants stood around, waiting for the fun to start.
"Now then, you little grob squiffler,"
boomed the Flesh Lump Eater.
"we is all of us wanting to know where you was galloping off to every day in the daytime. The human beings could easily be spotting you and starting a giant hunt, and we is not wanting that to happen, is we not?"
"We is not,"
shouted the other giants.
"Go back to your cave, 1v1.
I is not galloping to any human being country. I is going to the other places."
"I is thinking,"
said the Flesh Lump Eater,
"that you is catching human beings and keeping them as pets."
"Right you is,"
cried the Blood Bottler.
"Just now I is hearing him chittering away to one of them in his cave." "You is welcome to go and search my cave from frack to bunt. You can go looking to every crook or nanny. There is no human beans or stringy beans or runner beans or jelly beans or any other beans in there."
Sophie crouched still as a mouse inside the BFG's pocket. Through the tiny peephole she watched the giants clustering around the poor BFG. All of them had piggy little eyes and enormous mouths with thick sausage lips. When the Flesh Lump Eater was speaking, she got a glimpse of his tongue. It was jet black, like a slab of black steak. Every one of them was more than twice as tall as the BFG. Suddenly, the Flesh Lump Eater shot out two enormous hands and grabbed the BFG around the waist. He tossed him high in the air and shouted,
"Catch him, man-hugger!"
The man-hugger caught him. The other giants spread out quickly in a large circle, each giant about 20 yards from his neighbour. The man-hugger threw the BFG high and far, shouting,
Catch him, Bone Cruncher!
The Bone Cruncher ran forward and caught the tumbling BFG and immediately swung him up again.
Catch him, Tortuga!
He shouted. Sophie dug her nails into the side of the pocket, trying to prevent herself from tumbling out when she was upside down. She felt as though she were in a barrel going over the Niagara Falls.
"Catch him, me dripper!"
"Catch him, gizzard gulper!" "Catch him, maid basher!"
"Catch him, blood bottler!" "Catch him! Catch him! Catch him!"
In the end, they got bored with this game. They dumped the poor BFG on the ground. They gave him a few kicks and shouted,
"Run, you little runt! Let us be seeing how fast you is galloping!"
The BFG ran. The giants picked up rocks and hurled them after him. He managed to dodge them.
"Ruddy little runt! Troggy little twit!"
At last the BFG got clear of them all. Sophie popped her head up from the pocket. "I didn't like that."
Phew! Oh, few and far between. Oh, they was in a nasty crotching mood today, was they not? I is sorry you was having such a whirly-gig time.
No worse than you. Would they ever really hurt you?
I isn't ever trusting them.
How do they actually catch the humans they eat?
Sometimes they is swimming in from the sea like fishies, with only their heads showing above the water. And then out comes a big hairy hand and grabbles someone off the beach.
Children as well?
Often chidlers. Little chidlers who is building sandcastles on the beach. That is who the swimmling ones are after. Little chidlers is not so tough to eat as old Grandmama, so says the child-chewing giant.
As they talked, the BFG was galloping fast over the land. Sophie was standing right up in his waistcoat pocket now and holding onto the edge with both hands. Her head and shoulders were in the open, and the wind was blowing in her hair. How else?
The meat-dripping giant is preferring to pretend he is a big tree growing in the park. He is holding great big branches over his head, and there he is waiting until some happy families is coming to have a picnic under the spreading tree. The meat-dripping giant is watching them as they lay out their little picnic. But in the end, it is the meat-dripper who is having the picnic.
It's too awful.
The gizzard-gulping giant is lying high up between the roofs of houses in the big cities. He is watching the human beings walking on the street below. And when he sees one that looks like it has a whoopsie good flavour, he grabs it. He is simply reaching down and snitching it off the street like a monkey taking a nut. He says it is nice to be able to pick and choose what you is having for your supper.
Don't people see him doing it?
Never is they seeing him. Do not forget it is dusky dark at this time. Also, the gizzard gulper has a very fast arm.
But if all these people are disappearing every night, surely there's some sort of an outcry.
Do not forget that human beings is disappearing everywhere all the time, even without the giants is guzzling them up. Human beings is killing each other much quicker than the giants is doing it.
But they don't eat each other.
Giants isn't eating each other either. Nor is giants killing each other. Giants is not very lovely, but they is not killing each other. Nor is crocodile-dillies killing other crocodile-dillies. Nor is pussycats killing pussycats.
They kill mice.
Ah, but they's not killing their own kind. Human beings is the only animals that is killing their own kind.
Sophie kept silent.
I is not understanding human beings at all. You is a human being, and you is saying it is grizzling in Horrigus for giants to be eating human beings. Right or left?
Right.
But human beings is squishing each other all the time. They is shooting guns and going up in aeroplanes to drop their bombs on each other's heads every week. Human beings is always killing other human beings.
He was right. Of course he was right, and Sophie knew it. Even so, she said, defending her own race, I think it's rotten that those foul giants should go off every night to eat humans. Humans have never done them any harm.
That is what the little piggywig is saying every day. He is saying, I has never done any harm to the human being, so why should he be eating me?
Oh, dear.
The human beings is making rules to suit themselves. But the rules they is making do not suit the little piggywiggies. Am I right or left?
Right.
Giants is also making rules. Their rules is not suiting the human beings. Everybody is making his own rules to suit himself.
But you don't like it that those beastly giants are eating humans every night, do you?
I do not. One right is not making two lefts. Is you quite cozy down there in my pocket?
I'm fine. Then suddenly, once again, the BFG went into that magical top gear of his. He began hurtling forward with phenomenal leaps. The landscape became blurred, and again Sophie had to duck down out of the whistling gale to save her head from being blown off her shoulders. She crouched in the pocket and listened to the wind screaming past. But this time the BFG didn't stay in top gear long. It seemed as though he had had some barrier to cross, but having crossed it, he once again slowed down to his normal gallop, and Sophie was able to pop her head up. They were now in an altogether paler country. The sun had disappeared above a film of vapour. The land was flat and treeless, and there seemed to be no colour in it at all. They were in a country of swirling mists and ghostly vapours. There was some sort of grass underfoot. It was ashy grey. There was no sign of a living creature, and no sound at all, except for the soft thud of the BFG's footsteps. Suddenly he stopped.
We is here at last,
he announced, and bent down and lifted Sophie from his pocket and put her on the ground. She was still in her nightie and her feet were bare. She shivered and stared around her at the swirling mists and ghostly vapours. Where are we?
We is in dream country. This is where all dreams is beginning.
The big friendly giant put the suitcase on the ground.
From now on, We is keeping as still as winky little mices.
Sophie nodded. The BFG opened the suitcase and took out several empty glass jars. He set them ready on the ground with their screw tops removed. Then he stood up very straight. His head was now high up in the swirling mist, and it kept disappearing, then appearing again. He was holding the long net in his right hand. Sophie, staring upwards, saw through the mist that his colossal ears were beginning to swivel out from his head. They began waving gently to and fro. Suddenly, the BFG leapt high in the air and swung the net through the mist with a great swishing sweep of his arm.
Got him!
He cried. He lowered the net. Very carefully, he tipped something absolutely invisible from the net into a jar. He dropped the net and swiftly clapped one hand over the jar.
The top!
He whispered.
The jar top, quick!
Sophie picked up the top and handed it to him. He screwed it on tight. The BFG was very excited. He held the jar close to one ear and listened intently.
It's a wink squiffler,
he whispered with a thrill in his voice.
It's even better. It's a fizz wizard. It's a golden fizz wizard.
Sophie stared at him. Is it really a good one?
A good one? It's a golden fizz wizard. It is not often I is getting one of these. Please be still as a starfish now. I is thinking there may be a whole swarm of fizz wizards up here today. And do kindly stop breathing. You is terribly noisy down there.
I haven't moved a muscle.
Then don't.
The BFG answered sharply. Once again he stood up tall in the mist, holding his net at the ready. Then came the long silence, the waiting, the listening. And at last, with surprising suddenness, came the leap and the swish of the net. When the second dream was safely in the jar, and the top was screwed down, the BFG held it to his ear.
Oh, no! Oh, mince my maggots! Oh, swipe my swoggles!
What's the matter?
It's a troggle humper!
He shouted. His voice was filled with fury and anguish.
Oh, save our solos! Deliver us from weasels!
What are you talking about?
Oh, bash my eye bones!
He cried, waving the jar in the air.
I come all this way to get lovely golden dreams, and what is I catching?
What are you catching?
I is catching a frightsome troggle humper. This is a bad, bad dream. It is worse than a bad dream. It is a nightmare.
Oh, dear. What will you do with that?
I is never letting it go. If I do, then some poor little toddler will be having the most curdling time. This one is a real kicksy bogthumper. I is exploding it as soon as I get home.
Nightmares are horrible. I had one once and I woke up sweating all over.
With this one you will be waking up screaming all over.
Is it as bad as that?
It's worse. This is a really wopsy crop switcher.
You said it was a troggle humper.
It is also a bogthumper and a crop switcher. Ah, you wicked beastie, you.
He cried, holding up the jar and staring into it. Sophie, who was also staring into the glass jar, cried out, I can see it! There's something in there!
Of course there's something in there. You is looking at a frightsome troggle humper.
But you told me dreams were invisible.
They is always invisible until they is captured.
Inside the jar, Sophie could see the faint scarlet outline of something that looked like a mixture between a blob of gas and a bubble of jelly. It's wiggling all over the place. It's fighting to get out. It'll bash itself to bits.
The nastier the dream, the angrier it is getting when it is in prison. This one is a nasty, fierce, bog-rotting nightmare. Just look at him splashing himself against the glass.
It's quite frightening. The BFG started putting the bottles back into the suitcase. Is that all? Are we going?
I is so upset by this troggle-humping, butt-humping grub-switcher that I is not wishing to go on.
Soon Sophie was back in the waistcoat pocket, and the BFG was racing home as fast as he could go. When at last they came again onto the hot yellow wasteland, all the other giants were sprawled out on the ground, fast asleep.
They is always having 50 winks before they go scumpering off to hunt human beings in the evening.
He stopped for a few moments to let Sophie have a better look.
Giants is only sleeping every then and now. Not nearly as much as human beings. Human beings is crazy for sleeping. Is it ever occurring to you that a human being who is 50 is spending about 20 years sleeping fast?
I must admit that never occurred to me.
You should allow it to occur to you. Imagine it, please. This human being who says he is 50 has been fast asleep for 20 years and is not even knowing where he is, not even doing anything, not even thinking.
It's a funny thought.
Exactly. So what I is trying to explain to you is that a human being who says he is 50 is not 50. He is only 30.
What about me? I am 8.
You is not 8 at all. Human being babies and little chidlers is spending half their time sleeping. So you is only 4.
I'm 8.
You may think you is 8, but you has only spent 4 years of your life with your little eyes open. You is only 4, and please stop higgling me. Kitschy little snapper-whippers like you should not be higgling around with an old sage and onions who is hundreds of years more than you.
Sophie, peeping out from her pocket, examined the 9 sleeping giants. Most of them were lying on their backs with their enormous mouths wide open, and they were snoring like foghorns. Suddenly, the BFG gave a jump in the air.
By gumfrog! I is just having the most wopsy-whiffling idea.
What?
Wait. Hold your horse feathers.
He galloped off fast to his cave, with Sophie hanging on tight to the rim of his pocket. He rolled back the stone.
You stay where you is in my pocket, Huggy Bee. We is doing this lovely bit of buck-swashling both together.
He laid aside the net that hung onto the suitcase. He ran across to the other side of the cave and grabbed the long trumpet thing, the one he had been carrying when Sophie had first seen him in the village. With the suitcase in one hand and the trumpet in the other, he dashed out of the cave. When the BFG came near to the sleeping giants, he slowed his pace. He crept on his toes towards the ugly brutes. He went past the gizzard gulper, the blood bottler, the meat dripper, the child chewer. Then he stopped. He had reached the flesh lump eater. He pointed at him. Then he looked down at Sophie and gave her a big wink. He knelt on the ground and very quietly he opened the suitcase. He took out of it the glass jar containing the terrible, nightmarish troggle humper. They were about 10 feet away from the flesh lump eater's face. The snoring, snorting noise he was making was disgusting. Every now and again a big bubble of spit formed between his 2 open lips, and then it would burst with a splash and cover his face with saliva. Taking infinite care, the BFG unscrewed the top of the glass jar and tipped the squiggling, squirming, faintly scarlet troggle humper into the wide end of his long trumpet. He put the other end of the trumpet to his lips. He aimed the instrument directly at the flesh lump eater's face. He took a deep breath, puffed out his cheeks, and then, woof, he blew. Sophie saw a flash of pale red go darting towards the giant's face. For a split second it hovered above the face. Then it was gone. It seemed to have been sucked up the giant's nose. But it all happened so quickly, Sophie couldn't be sure.
We had better be skidding away, quick, to where it is safe.
The BFG whispered. He trotted off for about 100 yards, then he stopped. He crouched low to the earth.
Now, we is waiting for the gun and flames to begin.
They didn't have long to wait. The air was suddenly pierced by the most fearful roar Sophie had ever heard, and she saw the flesh lump eater's body, all 54 feet of it, rise up off the ground and fall back with a thump. Then it began to wriggle and twist and bounce about in the most violent fashion.
No!
Roared the flesh lump eater.
Oh, no!
He's still asleep. terrible trog-humpling nightmare is beginning to hit him.
Serves him right, Sophie said. She could feel no sympathy for this great brute who ate children as though they were sugar lumps.
Save us!
Screamed the flesh lump eater, thrashing about madly.
He is after me! He is getting me!
The thrashing of limbs and the waving of arms became more violent by the second. It was an awesome thing to watch such a massive creature having such mighty convulsions.
It's Jack!
Bellowed the flesh lump eater.
It's the grueful, gracious Jack!
The flesh lump eater was writhing about over the ground like some colossal tortured snake.
Jack is after me! Oh, spare me, Jack! Don't hurt me, Jack!
Who is this Jack he's on about?
Jack is the only human being all giants is frightened of. They is all absolutely terrified of Jack. They is all hearing that Jack is a famous giant killer.
Save me!
Screamed the flesh lump eater.
Have mercy on this poor little giant! The beanstalk! He is coming at me with his terrible spike-sticking beanstalk! Take it away! I is begging you, Jack!
Us giants is not knowing very much about this dreaded human being called Jack. We is knowing only that he is a famous giant killer, and that he is owning something called a beanstalk. We is knowing also that the beanstalk is a fearsome thing, and Jack is using it to kill giants.
Sophie couldn't stop smiling. Just then, one of the flesh lump eater's flailing fists caught the still fast asleep, meat-dripping giant smack in the mouth. At the same time, one of his furiously thrashing legs kicked the snoring, gizzard-gulping giant right in the guts. Both the injured giants woke up and leapt to their feet. The two of them rushed to the flesh lump eater and began pounding him with their fists and feet. The wretched flesh lump eater woke up with a bang. He awoke straight from one nightmare into another. He roared into battle, and in the bellowing, thumping, rough and tumble that followed, one sleeping giant after another either got stepped upon or kicked. Soon all 9 of them were on their feet, having the most almighty free-for-all. Blood flowed, noses went crunch, teeth fell out like hailstones. The BFG smiled a big, wide smile of absolute pleasure.
I is loving it when they is all having a good tough and rumble.
They'll kill each other.
Never. Those beasts is always bishing and walloping at one another. Soon it will be getting dusky, and they will be galloping off to fill their tummies.
As the BFG headed back to the cave, he said quietly,
We certainly was putting that nightmare to good use, though, wasn't we?
Excellent use. Well done, you. The big friendly giant was doing his homework. Sophie sat cross-legged on the tabletop nearby, watching him. The glass jar containing the one and only good dream they had caught that day stood between them. The BFG was printing something on a piece of paper with an enormous pencil. What are you writing?
Every dream is having its special label on the bottle. How else could I be finding the one I am wanting in a hurry?
But can you really and truly tell what sort of a dream it's going to be simply by listening to it?
I can. Every dream in the world is making a different sort of buzzy hum music. And these grand swashbuckling ears of mine is able to read that music.
By music, do you mean tunes?
I is not meaning tunes.
Then what do you mean?
Human beings is having their own music, right or left.
Right. Lots of music.
And sometimes human beings is very overcome when they is hearing wondrous music. They is getting shivers down their spindles, right or left.
Right.
So, the music is saying something to them. It is sending a message. I do not think the human beings is knowing what that message is, but they is loving it just the same.
That's about right.
But because of these jump-squiffling ears of mine, I is not only able to hear the music that dreams is making, but I is understanding it also.
What do you mean, understanding it?
I can read it. It talks to me. It is like a language.
He resumed his writing. Sophie moved over to read what he had written so far. The letters were printed big and bold, but were not very well formed. Here is what it said. This dream is about how I is saving my teacher from drowning. I is diving into the river from a high bridge, and I is dragging my teacher to the bank. Tell me honestly, if you blew this dream into my bedroom when I was asleep, would I really and truly start dreaming about how I saved my teacher from drowning by diving off the bridge?
More. A lot more. But I cannot be scribbling the whole grope-flunkering dream on a titchy bit of paper. Of course there is more.
The BFG laid down his pencil and placed one massive ear close to the jar. For about 30 seconds he listened intently.
Yes,
he said, nodding his great head solemnly up and down.
This dream is continuing very nice. It has a very dory-hunky ending.
How does it end? Please tell me.
You would be dreaming that the morning after you was saving the teacher from the river, you was arriving at school and you was seeing all the 500 pupils sitting in the assembly hall, and all the teachers as well, and the head teacher is then standing up and saying, I is wanting the whole school to give 3 cheers for Sophie, because she is so brave and is saving the life of our fine arithmetic teacher, Mr. Figgins, who was unfortunately pushed off the bridge into the river by our gym teacher, Miss Amelia Upscotch. So, 3 cheers for Sophie. And forever after that, even when you was getting your sums all gunk swizzled and muggled up, Mr. Figgins is always giving you 10 out of 10 and writing good work, Sophie, in your exercise book. Then you is waking up.
I like that dream.
Of course you like it. It is a fizz wizard.
He licked the back of the label and stuck it on the jar.
I is usually writing a bit more than this on the labels. But you was watching me and making me jumpsy.
I'll go and sit somewhere else.
No. Don't go. Look in the jar carefully, and I think you will be seeing this dream.
Sophie peered into the jar, and there, sure enough, she saw the faint translucent outline of something about the size of a hen's egg. There was just a touch of colour in it, a pale sea green, soft and shimmering and very beautiful. There it lay, this small sea green jellyish thing at the bottom of the jar, quite peaceful, but pulsing gently, the whole of it moving ever so slightly, as though it were breathing. It's moving! It's alive!
Of course it's alive.
Well, what will you feed it on?
It is not needing any food.
Everything alive needs food of some sort, even trees and plants.
The north wind is alive. It is moving. It touches you on the cheek and on the hands. But nobody is feeding it.
The BFG stood up and walked over to one of the many shelves and placed the latest jar among the thousands of others. Please, can I see some of the other dreams? Sophie asked him. The BFG picked her up off the table and stood her on the palm of one of his huge hands. He carried her towards the shelves.
Over here is some of the good dreams. The fizz wizards.
Would you hold me closer so I can read the labels?
My labels is only telling bits of it. The dreams is usually much longer. The labels is just to remind me.
Sophie started to read the labels. The first one seemed long enough to her. This is what it said. Today I is sitting in class and I discover that if I is staring very hard at my teacher in a special way, I is able to put her to sleep. So I keep staring at her, and in the end her head drops onto her desk and she goes fast asleep and snorkles loudly. Then in marches the head teacher, and he shouts, "Wake up, Miss Plumbridge! How dare you go to sleep in class? Go fetch your hat and coat and leave this school forever. You is sacked." But in a jiffy, I is putting the head teacher to sleep as well, and he just crumples slowly to the floor like a lump of jelly, and there he lies, all in a heap, and starts snorkeling even louder than Miss Plumbridge. And then I was hearing my mummy's voice saying, "Wake up, your breakfast is ready." What a funny dream.
It's a ring better. It's whoopsie.
Do you have separate dreams for boys and for girls?
Of course. If I is giving a girl's dream to a boy, even if it was a really whoopsie girl's dream, the boy would be waking up and thinking what a rot-bungling, grint-sludging old dream that was.
Boys would.
These here is all girls' dreams on this shelf.
Can I read a boy's dream?
You can.
And he lifted her to a higher shelf. The label on the nearest boy's dream jar read as follows: I is making myself a marvellous pair of suction boots, and when I put them on, I is able to walk straight up the kitchen wall and across the ceiling. Well, I is walking upside down on the ceiling when my big sister comes in, and she is starting to yell at me as she always does, yelling, "What on earth is you doing up there, walking on the ceiling?" And I looks down at her, and I smiles, and I says, "I told you you was driving me up the wall, and now you has done it." I find that one rather silly.
Boys wouldn't. It's another ring better. Perhaps you has seen enough now.
Let me read another boy's one. The next label read, The telephone rings in our house, and my father picks it up and says in his very important telephone voice, "Simpkins speaking." Then his face goes white, and his voice goes all funny, and he says, "What? Who?" And then he says, "Yes, sir, I understand, sir, but surely it is me you is wishing to speak to, sir, not my little son." My father's face is going from white to dark purple, and he is gulping like he has a lobster stuck in his throat, and then at last he is saying, "Yes, sir, very well, sir, I will get him, sir." And he turns to me and he says in a rather respectful voice, "Is you knowing the President of the United States?" And I says, "No, but I expect he is hearing about me." Then I is having a long talk on the phone and saying things like, "Let me take care of it, Mr. President. You'll bungle it all up if you do it your way." And my father's eyes is goggling right out of his head. And that is when I is hearing my father's real voice saying, "Get up, you lazy slob, or you will be late for school." Boys are crazy. Let me read this next one. Sophie started reading the next label. I has written a book, and it is so exciting nobody can put it down. As soon as you has read the first line, you is so hooked on it, you cannot stop until the last page. In all the cities, people is walking in the streets, bumping into each other because their faces is buried in my book, and dentists is reading it and trying to fill teeth at the same time, but nobody minds because they is all reading it too in the dentist's chair. Drivers is reading it while driving cars, and cars is crashing all over the country. Brain surgeons is reading it while they is operating on brains, and airline pilots is reading it going to Timbuktu instead of London. Football players is reading it on the fields because they can't put it down, and so is Olympic runners while they are running. Everybody has to see what is going to happen next in my book, and when I wake up, I is still tingling with excitement at being the greatest writer the world has ever known, until my mummy comes in and says, "I was looking at your English exercise book last night, and really your spelling is atrocious. So is your punctuation."
That's enough for now.
What amazes me is how you ever learned to write in the first place. The BFG crossed the cave and opened a tiny secret door in the wall. He took out a book, very old and tattered. By human standards, it was an ordinary-sized book, but it looked like a postage stamp in his huge hand.
One night, I is blowing a dream through a window, and I sees this book lying on the little boy's bedroom table. I wanted it so very badly, you understand. But I is refusing to steal it. I would never do that.
So how did you get it?
I borrowed it. Just for a short time, I borrowed it.
How long have you had it?
Perhaps only about 80 years. Soon I shall be putting it back.
And that's how you taught yourself to write?
I is reading it hundreds of times. And I is still reading it and teaching new words to myself and how to write them. It is the most scrumdiddly-umptious story.
Sophie took the book out of his hand. Nicholas Nickleby, she read aloud.
By Dahl's Chickens.
By who? Just then there came a tremendous noise of galloping feet from outside the cave.
Oh, here. That is all the giants zip-fizzing off to another country to guzzle human beings.
He quickly popped Sophie into his waistcoat pocket, then hurried to the cave entrance and rolled back the stone. Sophie, peeping out of her spy hole, saw all 9 of the fearsome giants coming past at a full gallop.
Where is you off to tonight?
Shouted the BFG.
We is all of us flush-bunking off to England,
answered the flesh-lump-eater.
We is fancying a few nice little English chidlers.
Aye!
Shouted the maid-masher.
It's knowing where there is a giggle house for girls.
And I know where there is a boggle boys,
shouted the gizzard gulper. In a few seconds, the 9 galloping giants were out of sight. What did he mean? Sophie said, poking her head out of the pocket. What is a giggle house for girls?
He is meaning a girls' school. He will be eating them by the bundle.
Oh, no!
And boys from a boys' school.
It mustn't happen. We've got to stop them.
Oh, there's not a thing we can do. We as helpless as horse feathers.
He sat down on a large, craggy blue rock near the entrance to his cave. He took Sophie from his pocket and put her beside him on the rock.
It is now quite safe for you to be outside until he is coming back.
But we can't just sit here doing nothing. How many girls and boys are they going to eat tonight?
Many. The flesh-lump-eating giant alone has a most squackling, wopsy appetite.
Do you always know where they're going?
Always. Every night they is yelling at me as they go bootling past. The other day they was yelling, we is off to Mississippi and Missouri to guzzle them both.
Sophie had never felt so helpless in her life. After a while, she stood up and cried out, I can't stand it! Just think of those poor girls and boys. We can't just sit here and do nothing. We've got to go after those brutes. The BFG sighed and shook his head firmly.
I has told you 5 or 6 times, and the 3rd will be the last. I is never showing myself to human beings.
Why ever not?
If I do, they will be putting me in the zoo with all the jiggy-raffs and catty-piddlers.
Nonsense.
And they will be sending you straight back to an orphanage. Grown-up human beings is not famous for their kindnesses. They is all squiffle-rotters and grink-sludgers.
That simply isn't true. Some of them are very kind indeed.
Who? Name one.
The Queen of England. You can't call her a squiffle-rotter or a grink-sludger.
Well,
Sophie was silent for a few moments. Then, suddenly, in a voice filled with excitement, she cried out, I've got it! By golly, I think I've got it!
Got what?
The answer! We'll go to the Queen. If I went and told the Queen about these disgusting man-eating giants, I'm sure she'd do something about it. The BFG looked down at her sadly and shook his head.
She is never believing you. Never in a month of Mondays.
I think she would.
Never. It is sounding such a wonky tall story. The Queen will be laughing and saying what awful rump squash.
She would not.
Of course she would. I has told you before that human beings is simply not believing in giants.
Now, hold on a sec. Just you hold on a sec, because I've got another idea.
Oh, your ideas is full of crodswoggle.
Not this one. You say that if we tell the Queen, she would never believe us.
I is certain she wouldn't.
But we aren't going to tell her. We don't have to tell her. We'll make her dream it.
That is an even more froth-bungling suggestion. You was only believing in a dream while you was actually dreaming it. But as soon as you was waking up, you was saying, oh, it was only a dream.
Don't you worry about that part of it. I can fix that.
Never can you fix it.
I can, I swear I can. But first of all, let me ask you a very important question. Here it is. Can you make a person dream absolutely anything in the world?
Anything you like.
If I said I wanted to dream that I was in a flying bathtub with silver wings, could you make me dream it?
I could.
But how? You obviously don't have exactly that dream in your collection.
I do not, but I could soon be mixing it up.
How could you mix it up?
It's a bit like mixing a cake. If you was putting the right amounts of all the different things into it, you was making the cake come out any way you want. Sugary, spongy, curranty, Christmassy or grobswitchy. It is the same with dreams.
Right. Now then, do you have dreams about the Queen of England?
Oh, lots of them.
And about giants?
Of course.
And about giants eating people?
Swiggles of them.
And about little girls like me?
Those is the commonest of all. I has bottles and bottles of dreams about little girls.
And could you mix them all up just as I want you to? Sophie asked, getting more and more excited.
Of course. But how is this helping us? I think he was barking up the wrong dog.
Sophie said, listen carefully. I want you to mix a dream which you will blow into the Queen of England's bedroom when she is asleep. And this is how it will go.
Now, hang on a minute, Tick. How is I possibly going to get near enough to the Queen of England's bedroom to blow in my dream?
I'll tell you that later. For the moment, please listen carefully. Here is the dream I want you to mix. Are you paying attention?
Very close.
I want the Queen to dream that 9 disgusting giants, each one about 50 feet tall, are galloping to England in the night and snatching little boys and girls from their beds. Let her dream that they will be reaching into the bedroom windows and pulling the little boys and girls out of their beds, and then... Do they eat them on the spot, or do they carry them away first? She asked.
Oh, they is usually just popping them straight into their mouths like popcorn.
Put that in the dream. And then the dream must say that when their tummies are full, they will go galloping back to giant country where no one can find them.
Is that all?
Certainly not. You must then explain to the Queen in her dream that there is a big friendly giant who can tell her where all those beasts are living, so that she can send her soldiers and her armies to capture them once and for all. And now let her dream one last very important thing. Let her dream that there is a little girl called Sophie sitting on her windowsill who will tell her where the big friendly giant is hiding.
Where is he hiding?
We'll come to that later. So the Queen dreams her dream, right?
Right.
Then she wakes up, and the first thing she thinks of is, oh, what a horrid dream. I'm so glad it was only a dream. And then she looks up from her pillow, and she sees a little girl called Sophie sitting on her windowsill.
How is you going to be sitting on the Queen's windowsill, may I beg?
You are going to put me there. And that's the lovely part about it. If someone dreams that there is a little girl sitting on her windowsill, and then she wakes up and sees that the little girl really is sitting there, that is a dream come true, is it not?
Ah, I is beginning to see where you is driving to. If the Queen is knowing that part of a dream is true, then perhaps she is believing the rest of it is true as well.
That's about it.
You said you was wanting the dream to say there is a big friendly giant who is also going to talk to the Queen.
Absolutely, you must. You are the only one who can tell her where to find the other giants.
I is not wanting to be shooted at by her soldiers.
The soldiers are only in the front of the palace. At the back there is a huge garden, and there are no soldiers in there at all.
How is you knowing all this about the Queen's palace?
Last year I was in a different orphanage. It was in London, and we used to go for walks all around there.
Is you helping me to find this palace? I has never dared to go hide and sneak in around London in my life.
I'll show you the way.
Oh, I is frightened of London.
Don't be. There are very few people about in the witching hour. The BFG got to his feet.
When is you wanting me to mix this special dream?
Now, at once.
When is we going to see the Queen?
Tonight, as soon as you've mixed the dream.
Tonight? Why such a flush-bunking flurry?
Well, if we can't save tonight's children, we can anyway save tomorrow's. What is more, I'm getting famished. I haven't had a thing to eat for 24 hours.
Then we had better get crackling.
It was dark now. The BFG, with Sophie sitting on his hand, hurried into the cave and put on those brilliant blinding lights that seemed to come from nowhere. He placed Sophie on the table.
Stay there, please, and no chittering. I is needing to listen only to silence when I is mixing up such a naughty, plexicated dream as this.
He got out an enormous empty glass jar that was the size of a washing machine. He clutched it to his chest and hurried towards the shelves on which stood the thousands and thousands of smaller jars containing the captured dreams.
Dreams about giants,
he muttered to himself as he searched the labels.
The giants is guzzling human beings. No, not that one. Nor that one. Ah, here's one. And here's another.
He tipped the dreams into the enormous jar he was clutching, and as each one went in, Sophie caught a glimpse of a small sea-green blob tumbling from one jar into the other. The BFG hurried towards another shelf.
Now, I is wanting dreams about giggle houses for girls and about boggle boxes for boys.
Sophie could almost see the excitement bubbling inside him as he scurried back and forth among his beloved jars.
Dreams about little girls. And dreams about me. About the BFG. Come on. Hurry up. Get on with it. Now, where in the wonky world is I keeping those?
In about half an hour, the BFG had found all the dreams he wanted and had tipped them into the one huge jar. He put the jar on the table. Sophie sat watching him but said nothing. Inside the big jar, she could clearly see about 50 of those oval sea-green jellious shapes, all pulsing gently, each one still a separate individual.
Now we is mixing them,
the BFG announced. He went to the cupboard, and from it he took out a gigantic egg beater. It was one of those ones that has a handle which you turn, and down below there are a lot of overlapping blades that go whizzing around. He inserted the bottom end of this contraption into the big jar where the dreams were lying.
Watch,
he said. He started turning the handle very fast. Flashes of green and blue exploded inside the jar. The dreams were being whisked into a sea-green froth. After about a minute, the BFG stopped whisking. The whole bottle was now full to the brim with large bubbles. They were almost exactly like the bubbles we ourselves blow from soapy water, except that these had even brighter and more beautiful colours swimming on their surfaces. Quite slowly, the topmost bubble rose up through the neck of the jar and floated away. A second one followed, then a third and a fourth. Soon the cave was filled with hundreds of beautifully coloured bubbles, all drifting gently through the air. It was a truly wonderful sight. As Sophie watched them, they all started floating towards the cave entrance, which was still open. They're going out.
Of course.
Where to?
Those is all little tiny dream bits that I isn't using.
It's all a bit beyond me.
Dreams is full of mystery and magic. Do not try to understand them. Look in the big bottle, and you will now see the dream you was wanting for the Queen.
Sophie turned and stared into the great jar. On the bottom of it, something was thrashing around wildly, bouncing up and down and flinging itself against the walls of the jar. Good heavens! Is that it?
That's it.
But it's horrible! It's jumping about! It wants to get out!
Ah, that's because it's a troggle humper. It's a nightmare.
Oh, but I don't want you to give the Queen a nightmare.
If she is dreaming about giants guzzling up little boys and girls, then what is you expecting it to be except a nightmare?
Sophie stared down at the fearful nightmare dream that was still thrashing away in the huge glass jar. It was much larger than the others. It was jellyish. It had tinges of bright scarlet deep inside it. There was something terrible about the way it was throwing itself against the sides of the jar.
I is thinking that your queen will be happy to have a nightmare if having a nightmare is going to save a lot of human beings from being gobbled up by filthsome giants. Is I right, or is I left?
I suppose you're right. It's got to be done.
She will soon be getting over it.
Have you put all the other important things into it?
When I is blowing that dream into the Queen's bedroom, she will be dreaming every single little thing-a-ling-a-ling you is asking me to make her dream.
About me sitting on the windowsill?
That part is very strong.
And about a big friendly giant?
I is putting in a nice long gobbet about him.
As he spoke, he picked up one of his smaller jars and very quickly tipped the struggling, thrashing troggle-humper out of the large jar into the small one. Then he screwed the lid tightly onto the small jar.
That's it. Is you ready to leave?
I'm ready. The BFG was putting on his great black cloak. He tucked the jar into a pocket in his cloak. He picked up his long trumpet-like dream blower. Then he turned and looked at Sophie, who was still on the tabletop.
The dream bottle is in my pocket. Where is you going to sit?
Sophie looked him over for a few minutes. Then she said, "If you would be kind enough to swivel one of your lovely big ears so that it is lying flat like a dish, that would make a very cosy place for me to sit."
By gumbo, that is a squackling good idea.
Slowly he swiveled his huge right ear until it was like a great shell facing the heavens. He lifted Sophie up and placed her into it. It was extremely comfortable.
You is tickling me a bit. Oh, please do not jiggle about.
I'll try not to. Are we ready?
Oh, don't do that.
I didn't do anything.
You is talking too loud. You was forgetting that I is hearing every little thing-a-ling-a-ling 50 times louder than usual. There is you shouting away right inside my ear.
Oh, gosh, I forgot that.
Your voice is sounding like thunder and trumpets.
I'm so sorry. Is that better?
No, it sounds as though you was shootling off a blunderbuss.
Sophie tried speaking right under her breath. Is this better?
That's better. Now I is hearing you very nicely. What is it you was trying to say to me just now?
I was saying, are we ready?
We is off,
cried the BFG, heading for the cave entrance.
We is off to meet Her Majesty the Queen.
The great yellow wasteland lay dim and milky in the moonlight as the big friendly giant went galloping across it. Sophie, still wearing only her nightie, was reclining comfortably in a crevice of the BFG's right ear. She was actually in the outer rim of the ear, near the top, where the edge of the ear folds over. And this folding over bit made a sort of roof for her and gave her wonderful protection against the rushing wind. The BFG went bouncing off the ground as though they were rockets in his toes, and each stride he took lifted him about 100 feet into the air. Sophie had not slept for a long time. She was very tired. She was also warm and comfortable. She dozed off. She didn't know how long she slept, but when she woke up again and looked out over the edge of the ear, the landscape had changed completely. They were in a green country now, with mountains and forest. It was still dark, but the moon was shining as brightly as ever. Suddenly, and without slowing his pace, the BFG turned his head sharply to the left.
Look, quick, over there,
he said, pointing his long trumpet. Sophie looked in the direction he was pointing. Through the darkness, all she saw at first was a great cloud of dust, about 300 yards away.
Those is the other giants, all galloping back home after their guzzle.
Then Sophie saw them. In the light of the moon, she saw all 9 of those monstrous, half-naked brutes thundering across the landscape together. They were galloping in a pack. their necks craned forward, their arms bent at the elbows, and worst of all, their stomachs bulging. Their feet pounded and thundered on the ground and left a great sheet of dust behind them. In 10 seconds, they were gone.
A lot of little girlsies and boysies is no longer sleeping in their beds tonight.
Sophie felt quite ill. It must have been about an hour or so later that the BFG began to slow his pace.
We is in England now.
Dark though it was, Sophie could see that they were in a country of green fields, with neat hedges in between the fields. There were hills with trees all over them, and occasionally there were roads with the lights of cars moving along. Each time they came to a road, the BFG was over it and away, and no motorist could possibly have seen anything except a quick black shadow flashing overhead. All at once, a curious orange-coloured glow appeared in the night sky ahead of them.
We is coming close to London.
He slowed to a trot. He began looking about cautiously. Groups of houses were now appearing on all sides, but there were still no lights in their windows. It was too early for anyone to be getting up yet.
Someone's bound to see us.
Never is they seeing me. You is forgetting that I is doing this sort of thing for years and years and years. No human being is ever catching even the smallest wink of me.
I did.
Ah, yes. But you was the very first.
There were quite a few people about, and there were cars with lights on, but nobody ever noticed the BFG. It was impossible to understand quite how he did it. There was a kind of magic in his movements. He seemed to melt into the shadows. He would glide noiselessly from one dark place to another, his black cloak blending with the shadows of the night. Sophie and the BFG came at last to a large place full of trees. There was a road running through it and a lake. There were no people in this place, and the BFG stopped for the first time since they had set out from his cave many hours before.
What's the matter?
I is in a bit of a puddle.
You're doing marvellously.
No, I isn't. I is now completely boggled. I is lost.
But why?
Because we is meant to be in the middle of London, and suddenly we is in green pastures.
Don't be silly. This is the middle of London. It's called Hyde Park. I know exactly where we are.
You is joking.
I'm not. I swear I'm not. We're almost there.
You mean we is nearly at the Queen's Palace?
It's just across the road.
Which way?
Straight ahead.
The BFG trotted forward through the deserted park.
Now stop.
The BFG stopped.
You see that huge roundabout ahead of us, just outside the park?
I see it.
That is Hyde Park Corner.
Even now, when it was still an hour before dawn, there was quite a lot of traffic moving around Hyde Park Corner. Then Sophie whispered,
In the middle of the roundabout, there is an enormous stone arch with a statue of a horse and a rider on top of it. Can you see that?
The BFG peered through the trees.
I is seeing it.
Do you think that if you took a very fast run at it, you could jump clear over Hyde Park Corner, over the arch, and over the horse and rider, and land on the pavement on the other side?
Easy.
You're sure? You're absolutely sure?
I promise.
Whatever you do, you mustn't land in the middle of Hyde Park Corner.
Don't get so flustered. To me, that is a snitchy little jump. There's not a thing-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling to it.
Then go.
The BFG broke into a full gallop. He went scorching across the park, and just before he reached the railings that divided it from the street, he took off. It was a gigantic leap. He flew high over Hyde Park Corner and landed as softly as a cat on the pavement the other side.
Well done. Now quick, over that wall.
Directly in front of them, bordering the pavement, there was a brick wall with fearsome-looking spikes all along the top of it. A swift crouch, a little leap, and the BFG was over it.
We're there. We're in the Queen's back garden.
By gumdrops! Is this really it?
There's the palace.
Not more than 100 yards away, the massive shape of the palace loomed through the darkness. The sheer size of it staggered the BFG.
But this place is having 100 bedrooms at least.
Easily, I should think.
Then I is boggled. How is I possibly finding the one where the Queen is sleeping?
Let's go a bit closer and have a look.
The BFG glided forward among the trees. Suddenly he stopped dead. The great ear in which Sophie was sitting began to swivel round.
Hey! You're going to tip me out.
Shh! I is hearing something.
He stopped behind a clump of bushes. He waited. The ear was still swinging this way and that. Sophie had to hang on tight to save herself from being tumbled out. The BFG pointed through a gap in the bushes, and there, not more than 50 yards away, she saw a man padding softly across the lawn. He had a guard dog with him on a leash. The BFG stayed as still as a stone. So did Sophie. The man and the dog walked on and disappeared into the darkness.
You was telling me they had no soldiers in the back garden.
He wasn't a soldier. He was some sort of a watchman. We'll have to be careful.
I is not too worried. These waxy big ears of mine is picking up even the noise of a man breathing the other side of this garden.
He glided forward through the vast garden, and once again Sophie noticed how he seemed to melt into the shadows wherever he went. His feet made no sound at all, even when he was walking on gravel. Suddenly they were right up close against the back wall of the great palace. The BFG's head was level with the upper windows one flight up, and Sophie, sitting in his ear, had the same view. In all the windows on that floor the curtains seemed to be drawn. There were no lights showing anywhere. The BFG stopped and put his other ear, the one Sophie wasn't sitting in, close to the first window.
No.
What are you listening for?
For breathing. I is able to tell if it is a man-human being or a lady by the breathing voice. We has a man in there, snortling a little bit too.
He glided on. He came to the next window. He listened.
No.
He moved on.
This room is empty.
He listened in at several more windows, but at each one he shook his head and moved on. When he came to the window in the very centre of the palace, he listened but did not move on.
Oh, we has a lady sleeping in there.
Sophie felt a little quiver go running down her spine.
But who?
The BFG put a finger to his lips for silence. He reached up through the open window and parted the curtains ever so slightly. The orange glow from the night sky over London crept into the room and cast a glimmer of light onto its walls. It was a large room, a lovely room, a rich carpet, gilded chairs, a dressing table, a bed, and in the bed lay a sleeping woman. Sophie suddenly found herself looking at a face she had seen on stamps and coins and in the newspapers all her life.
Is that her?
Yes.
The BFG wasted no time. First, and very carefully, he started to raise the lower half of the large window as far as it would go, so as to leave a place on the sill for Sophie to sit. Next, he closed the crack in the curtains. Then, with finger and thumb, he lifted Sophie out of his ear and placed her on the window ledge with her legs dangling just inside the room, but behind the curtains.
Now don't you go tip-toppling backwards. You must always be holding on tight with both hands to the inside of the windowsill.
Sophie did as he said. The BFG was taking the glass jar from the pocket of his cloak. He unscrewed the lid. Now, very cautiously, he poured the precious dream into the wide end of his trumpet. He steered the trumpet through the curtains far into the room, aiming it at the place where he knew the bed to be. He took a deep breath. He puffed out his cheeks, and puff! He blew. Now he was withdrawing the trumpet, sliding it out very carefully like a thermometer.
Is you all right sitting there?
Yes. How long will it take to work?
Some takes an hour. Some is quicker. Some is slower still. But it is sure to find her in the end.
Sophie said nothing.
I is going off to wait in the garden. When you is wanting me, just call out my name, and I is coming very quick.
Goodbye.
Suddenly, unexpectedly, the BFG leaned forward and kissed her gently on the cheek. When she turned to look at him, he was gone. Dawn came at last, and the rim of a lemon-coloured sun rose up behind the rooftop somewhere behind Victoria Station. A while later, Sophie felt a little of its warmth on her back and was grateful. In the distance she heard a church clock striking. She counted the strikes. There were 7. With all the patience of a small girl who has something important to wait for, Sophie sat motionless on the windowsill. How much longer? She wondered. Faint stirrings and distant sounds came to her from deep inside the belly of the palace. Then, all at once, beyond the curtains, she heard the voice of the sleeper in the bedroom. It was a slightly blurred sleep-talker's voice.
Oh, no! No, don't! Someone stop them! Don't let them do it! I can't bear it! Oh, please stop them! It's horrible! Oh, it's ghastly! No! No, no!
She is having the dream, Sophie said to herself.
It must be really horrid. I feel so sorry for her, but it has to be done.
After that there were a few moans. Then there was a long silence. Sophie waited. She looked over her shoulder. The garden was deserted. A pale summer mist hung over it like smoke. It was an enormous garden, very beautiful, with a large, funny-shaped lake at the far end. Inside the room, beyond the curtains, Sophie suddenly heard what was obviously a knock on the door. She heard the doorknob being turned. She heard someone entering the room.
Good morning, Your Majesty. Will you have your tray on the bed, ma'am, or on the table? Oh, Mary, something awful has just happened.
This was a voice Sophie had heard many times on radio and television, especially on Christmas Day. It was a very well-known voice.
Whatever is it, ma'am? I've had the most frightful dream. It was a nightmare. It was awful.
Oh, I am sorry, ma'am, but don't be distressed. You're awake now and it will go away. It was only a dream, ma'am.
Do you know what I dreamt, Mary? I dreamt that girls and boys were being snatched out of their beds at boarding school and were being eaten by the most ghastly giants. The giants were putting their arms in through the dormitory windows and plucking the children out with their fingers. It was all so vivid, Mary. It was so real.
There was suddenly a crash and a clatter of crockery, which could only have meant that the tray the maid was carrying had fallen out of her hands.
Mary,
the famous voice was saying rather sharply,
I think you'd better sit down at once. You look as though you're going to faint. You really mustn't take it so hard just because I've had an awful dream.
That isn't the reason, ma'am. The maid's voice was quivering terribly.
Then for heaven's sake, what is the reason?
You haven't seen the papers yet, have you, ma'am?
No. What did they say?
Sophie heard the rustling of a newspaper as it was being handed over. On the front page, ma'am, it's the big headlines.
Great Scott! Cried the famous voice. 18 gals vanished mysteriously from their beds at Rodian School. 14 boys disappear from Eton. Bones are found underneath dormitory windows.
Then there was a pause, punctuated by gasps from the famous voice, as the newspaper article was clearly being read and digested.
Oh, how ghastly! The famous voice cried out. It's absolutely frightful. Bones under the windows. What can have happened? Oh, those poor children.
But, ma'am, don't you see? Ma'am!
See what, Mary?
Those children were taken away almost exactly as you dreamt it, ma'am. That's why I came over all queer, ma'am.
I'm coming over a bit queer myself, Mary.
Shall I draw the curtains, ma'am? Then we shall all feel better. It's a lovely day.
Please do.
With a swish, the great curtains were pulled aside. The maid screamed. Sophie froze to the window ledge. The Queen, sitting up in her bed with the Times on her lap, glanced up sharply. Now it was her turn to freeze. She sat there, staring wide-eyed and white-faced at the small girl who was perched on her windowsill in a nightie. The maid, a middle-aged woman with a funny cap on the top of her head, was the first to recover. "What in the name of heaven do you think you're doing in here?" she shouted angrily to Sophie. Sophie looked beseechingly towards the Queen for help. "I don't believe it." "I'll take her out, ma'am, at once," the maid was saying. "No, Mary, no! Don't do that." The Queen spoke so sharply that the maid was quite taken aback. She turned and stared at the Queen. What on earth had come over her? "Are you quite all right, ma'am?" the maid was saying. When the Queen spoke again, it was in a strange sort of whisper.
"Tell me, Mary," she said. "Tell me quite truthfully. Is there really a little girl sitting on my windowsill, or am I still dreaming?"
"She's sitting there all right, ma'am, as clear as daylight. Your Majesty is certainly not dreaming."
"But that's exactly what I did dream," the Queen cried out. "I dreamt that as well. I dreamt that there would be a little girl sitting on my windowsill in her nightie, and she would talk to me."
The maid was lost. She had not been trained to cope with this kind of madness.
"Are you real?"
the Queen said to Sophie.
"Yes, Your Majesty,"
Sophie murmured.
"What is your name?"
"Sophie, Your Majesty."
"And how did you get up on my windowsill?"
"No, don't answer that. I dreamed that part of it, too. I dreamed that a giant put you there." "He did, Your Majesty,"
Sophie said. The maid gave a howl of anguish and clasped her hands over her face.
"Control yourself, Mary," the Queen said sharply.
Then to Sophie she said,
"You are not serious about the giant, are you?" "Oh, yes, Your Majesty. He's out there in the garden now." "Is he indeed?" the Queen said. "He is a good giant, Your Majesty," Sophie said. "You need not be frightened of him." "I'm delighted to hear it," said the Queen. "He is my best friend, Your Majesty." "How nice," the Queen said. "He's a lovely giant, Your Majesty." "I'm quite sure he is," the Queen said. "But why have you and this giant come to see me?" "I think you have dreamt that part of it too, Your Majesty," Sophie said calmly.
That pulled the Queen up short. She certainly had dreamed that part of it. She was remembering now how, at the end of her dream, it had said that a little girl and a big friendly giant would come and show her how to find the 9 horrible man-eating giants. But be careful, the Queen told herself. Keep very calm, because this is surely not very far from the place where madness begins.
"You did dream that, didn't you, Your Majesty?" "Yes. Yes, now you come to mention it, I did. But how do you know what I dreamed?" "Oh, that's a very long story, Your Majesty," Sophie said. "Would you like me to call the big friendly giant?"
The Queen took a deep breath. She was glad no one except her faithful old Mary was here to see what was going on.
"Very well," she said. "You may call your giant. No, wait a moment. Mary, pull yourself together and give me my dressing gown and slippers."
The maid did as she was told. The Queen got out of bed and put on a pale pink dressing gown and slippers.
"You may call him now,"
the Queen said. Sophie turned her head towards the garden and called out,
"BFG! Her Majesty the Queen would like to see you."
The Queen crossed over to the window and stood beside Sophie. Sophie jumped down into the room and stood beside the Queen at the open window. Mary, the maid, stood behind them.
"I don't see any giant," the Queen said.
"Please wait," Sophie said. Just then there was a rustle in the bushes beside the lake. Then out he came, 24 feet tall, wearing his black cloak with the grace of a nobleman, still carrying his long trumpet in one hand. He strode magnificently across the palace lawn towards the window. The maid screamed. The Queen gasped. Sophie waved. The BFG took his time. When he was close to the window, where the 3 of them were standing, he stopped and made a slow, graceful bow.
"Your Majesty, I is your humbug servant."
He bowed again. Considering she was meeting a giant for the first time in her life, the Queen remained astonishingly self-composed.
"We are very pleased to meet you," she said.
"Oh, Magister! Oh, Queen! Oh, Golden Sovereign! Oh, Ruler! Oh, Ruler of Straight Lines! Oh, Sultana! I is come here with my little friend, Sophie, to give you a—"
The BFG hesitated, searching for the word.
"To give me what?"
the Queen said.
assistance.
The BFG said, beaming. The Queen looked puzzled.
He sometimes speaks a bit funny, Your Majesty. He never went to school.
I has great secrets to tell your Magister.
"I should be delighted to hear them," the Queen said, "but not in my dressing gown. Have either of you had breakfast?"
"Oh, could we?"
Sophie cried.
"Oh, please, I haven't eaten a thing since yesterday."
"I was about to have mine," the Queen said, "but Mary dropped it."
The maid gulped.
"I imagine we have more food in the palace," the Queen said, speaking to the BFG. "Perhaps you and your little friend would care to join me."
Will it be repulsant snozzcumbers, Magister?
The BFG asked.
"What is he talking about?" the Queen said. "It sounds like a rude word to me."
She turned to the maid and said,
"Mary, ask them to serve breakfast for 3 in the... I think it had better be in the ballroom. That has the highest ceiling."
To the BFG she said,
"I'm afraid you will have to go through the door on your hands and knees. I'll send someone to show you the way."
The BFG reached up and lifted Sophie out of the window.
You and I is leaving Her Magister alone to get dressed.
"No, leave the little girl here with me," the Queen said. "We'll have to find something for her to put on. She can't have breakfast in her nightie."
The BFG returned Sophie to the bedroom.
"Can we have sausages, Your Majesty?"
Sophie asked.
"And bacon and fried eggs?"
"I think that might be managed," the Queen answered, smiling.
"Just you wait till you taste it,"
Sophie said to the BFG. Mr. Tibbs skimmed into the ballroom. Butlers don't walk, they skim over the ground, followed by a whole army of footmen. The footmen all wore knee breeches, and every one of them displayed beautifully rounded calves and ankles.
"Push the grand piano into the centre of the room,"
Mr. Tibbs whispered. Butlers never raised their voices above the softest whisper. 4 footmen moved the piano.
"Now fetch a large chest of drawers and put it on top of the piano,"
Mr. Tibbs whispered. 3 other footmen fetched a very fine Chippendale mahogany chest of drawers and placed it on top of the piano.
"That will be his chair. It is exactly 8 feet off the ground. Now we shall make a table upon which this gentleman may eat his breakfast in comfort. Fetch me 4 very tall grandfather clocks. Let each clock be 12 feet high."
16 footmen spread out around the palace to find the clocks. They required 4 footmen to each one.
"Place the 4 clocks in a rectangle 8 feet by 4 alongside the grand piano."
The footmen did so.
"Now fetch me the young prince's ping-pong table."
The ping-pong table was carried in.
"Now place the ping-pong table on top of the 4 grandfather clocks."
To manage this, the footmen had to stand on step-ladders. Mr. Tibbs stood back to survey the new furniture.
"Not in the classic style, but it will have to do."
He gave orders that a damask tablecloth should be draped over the ping-pong table. At this point, Mr. Tibbs was seen to hesitate. The footmen all stared at him aghast. Butlers never hesitate. It is their job to be totally decisive at all times. But Mr. Tibbs didn't hesitate for long.
"Tell the head gardener that I require immediately a brand-new unused garden fork and also a spade. And for a knife we shall use the great sword hanging on the wall in the morning room. But clean the sword well first. It was last used to cut off the head of King Charles I, and there may still be a little dried blood on the blade.
Mr. Tibbs stood near the centre of the ballroom, casting his expert butler's eye over the scene. Had he forgotten anything? He certainly had. What about a coffee cup for the large gentleman?
Fetch me the biggest jug you could find in the kitchen.
So much for the giant. Mr. Tibbs then had the footman move a small, delicate table and 2 chairs alongside the giant's table. This was for the Queen and for Sophie. All these arrangements were only just completed when the Queen, now fully dressed in a trim skirt and cashmere cardigan, entered the ballroom holding Sophie by the hand. A pretty blue dress that had once belonged to a little princess had been found for Sophie, and to make her look prettier still, the Queen had picked up a superb sapphire brooch from her dressing table and had pinned it onto the left side of Sophie's chest. The big friendly giant followed behind them, but he had an awful job getting through the door. He had to squeeze through on his hands and knees, with 2 footmen pushing him from behind and 2 pulling him from the front. He had removed his black cloak and got rid of his trumpet, and was now wearing his ordinary simple clothes. As he walked across the ballroom, he failed to notice an enormous crystal chandelier. Crash went his head. A shower of glass fell upon the poor BFG.
Gunhammers and bogswinkles! What was that?
It was Louis XV, the Queen said, looking slightly put out.
He's never been in a house before,
Sophie said. Mr. Tibbs directed 4 footmen to clear up the mess. Then he indicated to the giant that he should sit himself on top of the chest of drawers, on top of the grand piano.
What a fizz-whizzing, flush-bunking seat! Oh, he is going to be bug as a snuck in a rug up here.
Does he always speak like that?
The Queen asked.
Quite often.
The BFG sat down on the chest of drawers piano and gazed in wonder around the great ballroom.
By gumdrops, what a spliffling wopsy room we is in. It is so gigantuous, I is needing binoculars and telescopes to see what is going on at the other end.
Footmen arrived carrying silver trays with fried eggs, bacon, sausages, and fried potatoes. At this point, Mr. Tibbs suddenly realized that in order to serve the BFG, he would have to climb to the top of one of the tall step-ladders, balancing a huge warm plate on the palm of one hand, and holding a gigantic silver coffee pot in the other. A normal man would have flinched at the thought of it, but good butlers never flinch. Up he went, up and up and up, while the Queen and Sophie watched him with great interest. It is possible they were both secretly hoping he would lose his balance and go crashing to the floor, but good butlers never crash. At the top of the ladder, Mr. Tibbs poured the BFG's coffee and placed the enormous plate before him. On the plate were 8 eggs, 12 sausages, 16 rashers of bacon, and a heap of fried potatoes.
What is this, please, your Magister?
The BFG asked, peering down at the Queen.
He has never eaten anything except snotcumbers before in his life,
Sophie explained.
They taste revolting.
They don't seem to have stunted his growth, the Queen said. The BFG grabbed the garden spade and scooped up all the eggs, sausages, bacon, and potatoes in one go and shoveled them into his enormous mouth.
Oh, by goggles! Oh, this stuff is making snozcumbers taste like Swatch collop.
Tibbs, the Queen said, showing true regal hospitality, fetch the gentleman another dozen fried eggs and a dozen sausages. Mr. Tibbs swam out of the room, muttering unspeakable words to himself and wiping his brow with a white handkerchief. The BFG lifted the huge jug and took a swallow.
Ouch!
He cried, blowing a mouthful across the ballroom.
Oh, please! What is this horrible swig spill I is drinking, Magister?
It's coffee, the Queen told him. Freshly roasted.
It's filthsome. Where is the frobscottle?
The what?
A delumptious fizzy frobscottle. Everyone must be drinking flopscottle with breakfast, Magister. Then we can all be whiz-popping happily together afterwards.
What does he mean? The Queen said, frowning at Sophie. What is whiz-popping? Sophie kept a very straight face.
BFG, there is no flopscottle here, and whiz-popping is strictly forbidden.
What? No flopscottle? No whiz-popping? No glumptious music? No boom, boom, boom?
Absolutely not,
Sophie told him firmly. If he wants to sing, please don't stop him, the Queen said.
He doesn't want to sing,
Sophie said. He said he wants to make music. Shall I send for a violin?
No, Your Majesty, he's only joking.
A sly little smile crossed the BFG's face.
Listen,
he said, peering down at Sophie.
If they isn't having any flopscottle here in the palace, I can still go whiz-popping perfectly well without it if I is trying hard enough.
No, don't. You're not to. I beg you.
Music is very good for the digestion, the Queen said. When I'm up in Scotland, they play the bagpipes outside the window while I'm eating. Do play something.
I has Her Majesty's permission,
cried the BFG, and all at once he let fly with a whiz-popper that sounded as though a bomb had exploded in the room. The Queen jumped.
Whoopee! That is better than baglepipes, is it not, Magister?
It took the Queen a few seconds to get over the shock. I prefer the bagpipes, she said, but she couldn't stop herself smiling. During the next 20 minutes, a whole relay of footmen were kept busy, hurrying to and fro from the kitchen, carrying third helpings and fourth helpings and fifth helpings of fried egg and sausages for the ravenous and delighted BFG. While all this was going on, Sophie had been telling the Queen everything, absolutely everything, about her visit to Giant Country. The Queen listened, appalled. When Sophie had finished, the Queen looked up at the BFG, who was sitting high above her. He was now eating a sponge cake. Big friendly giant. Last night, those man-eating brutes came to England. Can you remember where they went the night before? The BFG put a whole round sponge cake into his mouth and chewed it slowly while he thought about this question.
Yes, Magister. I do think I is remembering where they said they was going the night before last. They was galloping off to Sweden for the Sweden sour taste.
Fetch me a telephone, the Queen commanded. Mr. Tibbs placed the instrument on the table. The Queen lifted the receiver. Get me the King of Sweden, she said. Good morning, the Queen said. Is everything all right in Sweden?
Everything is terrible,
the King of Sweden answered.
There is panic in the capital. 2 nights ago, 26 of my loyal subjects disappeared. My whole country is in a panic.
Your 26 loyal subjects were all eaten by giants. Apparently they like the taste of sweets.
Why do they like the taste of sweets?
The King asked. Because the sweets of Sweden have a sweet and sour taste, the Queen said.
I don't know what you're talking about,
the King said, growing testy.
It's hardly a joking matter when one's loyal subjects are being eaten like a popcorn.
They've eaten mine as well.
Who's they, for heaven's sake?
The King asked. Giants, the Queen said.
Look here, are you feeling all right?
It's been a rough morning. First I had a horrid nightmare, then the maid brought my breakfast, and now I've got a giant on the piano.
You need a doctor quick.
I'll be all right, the Queen said. I must go now. Thanks for your help. She replaced the receiver. That proves it, she said, looking up at the BFG. Your story is apparently quite true. Summon the head of the army and the head of the Air Force immediately. The head of the army and the head of the Air Force stood at attention beside the Queen's breakfast table. Sophie was still in her seat, and the BFG was still high up on his crazy perch. It took the Queen only 5 minutes to explain the situation to the military men.
Yes, I knew there was something like this going on, Your Majesty.
The head of the army said.
For the last 10 years, we've been getting reports from nearly every country in the world about people disappearing mysteriously in the night.
The Queen said,
What time is it? 10 a.m. In 8 hours, those 9 bloodthirsty brutes will be galloping off to gobble up another couple of dozen unfortunate wretches. They have to be stopped. We must act fast.
Well, bomb the blighters,
shouted the head of the Air Force.
I do not approve of murder, the Queen said.
But they are murderers themselves,
cried the head of the army.
That is no reason why we should follow their example. 2 wrongs don't make a right.
And 2 rights don't make a left,
cried the BFG.
We must bring them back alive.
How?
Said the 2 military men together.
Wait. Hold your horseflies. Keep your skirts on. I think I has the answer to the maiden's hair.
Let him speak, the Queen said.
Every afternoon, all these giants is in the land of Noddy.
Well, I can't understand a word this fellow's saying.
The head of the army snapped.
He means the land of Nod, Sophie said. It's pretty obvious.
Exactly. Every afternoon, all these 9 giants is lying on the ground snoozling away in a very deep sleep.
Well, go on,
they said.
So what?
So, what you soldiers has to do is to creep up to the giants while they is still in the land of Noddy and tie their arms and legs with mighty ropes and chains.
Brilliant,
the Queen said.
Oh, well, that's all very well,
said the head of the army.
Well, how do we get the brute back here? We can't load 50-foot giants onto trucks. Shoot them on the spot, that's what I say.
The BFG looked down from his lofty perch and said, this time to the head of the Air Force,
You is having belly poppers, is you not? Is he being rude?
The head of the Air Force said.
He means helicopters,
Sophie told him.
Of course we have helicopters.
Whoopsie big belly poppers?
Very big ones.
The head of the Air Force said proudly.
But no helicopter is big enough to get a giant like that inside.
You do not put him inside,
the BFG said.
You sling him underneath the belly of your belly popper and carry him like a torpedo.
Like a what?
Said the head of the Air Force.
Like a torpedo,
Sophie said.
Could you do that, Air Marshal? The Queen asked.
Well, I suppose we could.
Then get cracking, the Queen said. You'll need 9 helicopters, 1 for each giant.
Well, where is this place?
The Air Force man said to the BFG.
I presume you can pinpoint it on the map.
Pinpoint? Map? Is this Air Force been talking slush bungle?
The Air Marshal's face turned the colour of a ripe plum. He was not used to being told he was talking slush bungle. The Queen, with her usual admirable tact and good sense, came to the rescue.
BFG, she said, can you tell us more or less where this giant country is?
No, Magister. Not on my Nelly.
Oh, well, then we're jiggered,
cried the Army General.
This is ridiculous,
cried the Air Marshal.
You must not be given up so easy,
the BFG said calmly.
The first titchy bobstickle you meet, and you begin shouting you is Biff Squiggled.
The Army General was no more used to being insulted than the Air Marshal. His face began to swell with fury, and his cheeks blew out until they looked like 2 huge ripe tomatoes.
Your Majesty, we are dealing with a lunatic.
The Queen, who was used to the tantrums of her senior officials, ignored him completely.
BFG, she said, would you please tell these rather dim-witted characters exactly what to do?
A pleasure, Magister. Now, listen to me carefully, you 2 boot-bogglers.
The military men began to twitch, but they stayed put.
I is not having the foggiest idea where giant country is in the world, but I is always able to gallop there. So all you is having to do is this. Put your 9 big belly hoppers up in the air and let them follow me as I is galloping along. If we's leaving now, we will be arriving just as the giants is having their afternoon snozzle.
Splendid, said the Queen. Then turning to the 2 military men, she said, Prepare to leave immediately. The head of the army, who was feeling pretty miffed by the whole business, said,
Well, that's all very well, Your Majesty. What are we going to do with the blighters once we've got them back?
Don't you worry about that, the Queen told him. Hurry up now. Off you go. The BFG got down from his high chair. He picked Sophie up in his fingers. He swiveled his huge right ear until it was parallel with the ground. Then he placed Sophie gently inside it. The Queen smiled. You really are rather a wonderful giant, she said.
Magister, I is wishing to ask you a very special thing from you.
What is it?
Could I please bring back here in the belly poppers all my collection of dreams? They is taking me years and years to collect, and I is not wanting to lose them.
Why, of course, the Queen said. I wish you a safe journey. The BFG had never before travelled in broad daylight. He hadn't dared to. But this was different. Now he was doing it for the Queen of England herself, and he was frightened of nobody. As he galloped across the British Isles with the helicopters thundering above him, people stood and gaped and wondered what on earth was going on.
Be careful to hang on tight. We is going fast as a fizzle crump.
The BFG changed into his famous top gear, and all at once he began to fly forward as though there were springs in his legs and rockets at his toes. He went skimming over the earth like some magical hop, skip and jumper, with his feet hardly ever touching the ground. Sophie had to crouch low in the crevice of his ear to save herself from being swept clean away. The 9 pilots in their helicopters suddenly realized they were being left behind. They opened their throttles to full speed, and even then they were only just able to keep up. In the leading machine, the head of the Air Force was sitting beside the pilot. He had a world atlas on his knees. Frantically, he turned the pages of his atlas.
Where the devil are we going?
I have the foghouse idea. The Queen's orders were to follow the giant, and that's exactly what I'm doing.
The pilot was a young Air Force officer with a bushy moustache. He was also quite fearless, and he loved adventure.
It's fun going to new places.
New places?
Shouted the head of the Air Force.
What the blazes do you mean, new places?
Well, this place we're flying over now isn't in the atlas, is it?
The pilot said, grinning.
You're darn right it isn't in the atlas.
Cried the head of the Air Force.
We've flown clear off the last page.
I expect that old giant knows where he's going.
The young pilot said.
He's leading us to disaster.
Cried the head of the Air Force. He was shaking with fear. In the seat beside him sat the head of the army, who was even more terrified.
You don't mean to tell me we've gone right off the atlas?
That's exactly what I'm telling you.
Cried the Air Force man.
Look for yourself. Here's the very last map in the whole flaming atlas. We went off that over an hour ago.
He turned the page. As in all atlases, there were now 2 completely blank pages at the very end.
So now we must be somewhere here,
he said, putting a finger on one of the blank pages. The young pilot was still grinning broadly. He said to them,
That's why they always put 2 blank pages at the back of the atlas. They're for new countries. You're meant to fill them in yourself.
The head of the Air Force glanced down at the ground below.
Just look at this God-forsaken desert. All the trees are dead and all the rocks are blue.
The giant has stopped.
The young pilot said.
He's waving us down.
All 9 helicopters landed safely on the great yellow wasteland. Then each of them lowered a ramp from its belly. 9 jeeps, 1 from each helicopter, were driven down the ramps. Each jeep contained 6 soldiers and a vast quantity of thick rope and heavy chains.
Well, I don't see any giants.
The head of the army said.
The giants is all just out of sight over there. But if you was taking these slosh-buckling, noisy belly-poppers any closer, all the giants is waking up at once, and then pop goes the weasel.
Oh, so you want us to proceed by jeep?
The head of the army said.
Yes, but you must all be very, very hushy quiet. No roaring of motors, no shouting, no mucking about, no piggery-jokery.
The BFG, with Sophie still in his ear, trotted forward and the jeeps followed close behind. Suddenly, the most dreadful rumbling noise was heard by everyone. The head of the army went pea-green in the face.
Well, those are guns. Come on, turn back, the lot of you.
Pig's piffle. Those noises is not guns.
Of course they're guns,
shouted the head of the army.
I am a military man, and I know a gun when I hear one.
Those is just the giants snortling in their sleep. I is a giant, and I know a giant snortle when I is hearing one.
Oh, you quite sure?
The army man said anxiously.
Positive.
Proceed cautiously,
the army man ordered. They all moved on. Then they saw them. Even at a distance they were enough to scare the daylights out of the soldiers. But when they got close and saw what the giants really looked like, they began to sweat with fear. 9 fearsome, ugly, half-naked, 50 feet long brutes lay sprawled over the ground in various grotesque attitudes of sleep, and the sound of their snoring was indeed like gunfire in a battle. The BFG raised a hand. The jeeps all stopped. The soldiers got out.
What happens if one of them wakes up?
Whispered the head of the army, his knees knocking together from fear.
If any one of them is waking up, he will gobble you down before you can say natchive.
The BFG answered, grinning hugely.
Me is the only one that won't be gobbled up, because giants is never eating giants. Me and Sophie is the only safe ones, because I is hiding her if that happens.
The head of the army took several paces to the rear. So did the head of the Air Force. They climbed rather quickly back into their jeep, ready to make a fast getaway if necessary.
Go forward, men.
The head of the army said.
Go on, go forward. Do your duty bravely.
The soldiers crept forward with their ropes and chains. All of them were trembling mightily. None dared to speak a word. To give the soldiers their due, they were extremely courageous. There were 6 well-trained, efficient men working on each giant, and within 10 minutes, 8 out of the 9 giants had been trussed up like chickens, and were still snoring contentedly. The 9th, who happened to be the flesh lump eater, was causing trouble for the soldiers because he was lying with his right arm tucked underneath his enormous body. It was impossible to tie his wrists and arm together without first getting that arm out from underneath him. Very, very cautiously, the 6 soldiers who were working on the flesh lump eater began to pull at the huge arm, trying to release it. The flesh lump eater opened his tiny, piggy black eyes. Suddenly, he saw the soldiers. In a flash, he was sitting up. He looked around him. He saw more soldiers. With a roar, he leapt to his feet. The soldiers, petrified with fear, froze where they were. They had no weapons with them. The head of the army put his jeep into reverse.
Human being!
The flesh lump eater yelled.
What is all you flashbanging, rotsome, half-baked beans doing in our country?
He made a grab at a soldier and swept him up in his hand.
I is having early suppers today.
He shouted, holding the poor squirming soldier at arm's length and roaring with laughter. Sophie, standing on the palm of the BFG's hand, was watching horror-struck. "Do something!" she cried.
Put that human being down!
The flesh lump eater turned and stared at the BFG.
What is you doing here with all these grotty twiglets?
He bellowed. The BFG made a rush at the flesh lump eater, but the colossal 54-foot-high giant simply knocked him over with a flick of his free arm. Sophie fell off the BFG's palm onto the ground. Her mind was racing. She must do something. She must. She must. She remembered the sapphire brooch the Queen had pinned onto her chest. Quickly, she undid it. Sophie ran up behind the flesh lump eater. She was holding the brooch between her fingers. When she was right up close to the great naked hairy legs, she rammed the 3-inch-long pin of the brooch as hard as she could into the flesh lump eater's right ankle. It went deep into the flesh and stayed there. The giant gave a roar of pain and jumped high in the air. He dropped the soldier and made a grab for his ankle. The BFG saw his chance.
You was bitten by a snake. I seed it biting you. It was a frightsome poisonous viper. It was a dreadly dangerous windscreen viper.
Save our souls!
Bellowed the flesh lump eater. He flopped to the ground and sat there howling his head off and clutching his ankle with both hands. His fingers felt the brooch.
The teeth of that Redley viper is still sticking into me. Oh! I is feeling the teeth sticking into my anklet.
The BFG saw his second chance.
We must be getting those viper's teeth out at once. Otherwise you is deader than duck soup. I is helping you.
The BFG knelt down beside the flesh lump eater.
You must grab your anklet very tight with both hands. That will stop the poisonous juices from the venensome viper going up your leg and into your heart.
The flesh lump eater grabbed his ankle with both hands.
Now, close your eyes and grittle your teeth, and look up to heaven and say your prayers, while I is taking out the teeth of the venensome viper.
The terrified flesh lump eater did exactly as he was told. The BFG signaled for some rope. A soldier rushed it over to him. With both the flesh lump eater's hands gripping his ankle, it was a simple matter for the BFG to tie the ankles and hands together with a tight knot.
There he is,
said the BFG, standing up.
You can look now.
When the flesh lump eater saw that he was trussed up like a turkey, he gave a yell so loud that the heavens trembled. He rolled and he wriggled, he fought and he figgled, he squirmed and he squiggled, but there was not a thing he could do. "Well done, you!" Sophie cried.
And well done you,
said the BFG, smiling down at the little girl.
You is saving all of our lives.
Will you please get that brooch back for me? It belongs to the Queen.
The BFG pulled the beautiful brooch out of the flesh lump eater's ankle. The flesh lump eater howled. The BFG wiped the pin and handed it back to Sophie. The heads of the Army and the Air Force drove forward once again in their jeep.
Her Majesty will be very pleased with me,
the head of the Army said.
I shall probably get a medal. All right, what's the next move?
Now you is all driving over to my cave to load up my bottles of dreams.
While the soldiers were loading the dreams, the BFG and Sophie disappeared over the mountains on a mysterious errand. When they came back, the BFG had a sack the size of a small house slung over his shoulder.
What's that you've got in there?
The head of the Army demanded to know.
Curiosity is killing the rat,
the BFG said, and he turned away from the silly man. When he was sure that all his precious dreams had been safely loaded onto the jeeps, the BFG said,
Now we is driving back to the belly poppers and picking up the frightsome giants.
The jeeps drove back to the helicopters. The 50,000 dreams were carried carefully, jar by jar, onto the helicopters. The soldiers climbed back on board, but the BFG and Sophie stayed on the ground. Then they all returned to where the 9 giants were lying. It was a fine sight to see them, these great air machines hovering over the trussed-up giants. It was an even finer sight to see the giants being woken up by the terrific thundering of the engines overhead. And the finest sight of all was to observe those 9 hideous brutes squirming and twisting about on the ground like a mass of mighty snakes as they tried to free themselves from their ropes and chains.
I is flesh-bunkled,
roared the flesh lump eater.
I is split-swiggled,
yelled the child chewer.
I is swat-walloped,
bellowed the bone cruncher.
I is goose-crumbled,
howled the man hugger.
I is guzzle-swiped,
shouted the meat dripper.
I is flut-gungled,
screamed the maid masher.
I is slopped-groggled,
squawked the gizzard gulper.
I is grudge-squinkle,
yowled the blood bottler.
I is bop-mugged,
screeched the butcher boy. The 9 giant-carrying helicopters each chose a separate giant and hovered directly over him. Very strong steel hawsers with hooks on the end of them were lowered from the front and rear of each helicopter. The BFG quickly secured the hooks onto the giant's chains, one hook near the legs and the other near the arms. Then, very slowly, the giants were winched up into the air. The giants roared and bellowed, but there was nothing they could do. The BFG, with Sophie once more resting comfortably in his ear, set off at a gallop for England. The helicopters all banked around and followed after him. The giants must have found it an interesting experience. They never stopped bellowing,
but their howls were drowned by the noise of the engines. When it began to get dark, the helicopters switched on powerful searchlights and trained them on the galloping giant so as to keep him in sight. They flew right through the night and arrived in England just as dawn was breaking. While the giants were being captured, a tremendous bustle and hustle was going on back home in England. Every earth digger and mechanical contrivance in the country had been mobilized to dig a colossal hole. 10,000 men and 10,000 machines worked ceaselessly through the night under powerful arc lights, and the massive task was completed only just in time. The hole itself was about twice the size of a football field and 500 feet deep. The walls were perpendicular, and engineers had calculated that there was no way a giant could escape once he was put in. Even if all 9 giants were to stand on each other's shoulders, the topmost giant would still be some 50 feet from the top of the hole. The 9 helicopters hovered over the massive pit. The giants, one by one, were lowered to the floor. But they were still trussed up, and now came the tricky business of releasing them from their bonds. Nobody wanted to go down and do this, because the moment a giant was freed, he would be sure to turn on the wretched person who had freed him and gobble him up. As usual, the BFG had the answer.
I has told you before. Giants is never eating giants, so I shall untie them myself.
With thousands of fascinated spectators, including the Queen, peering down into the pit, the BFG was lowered on a rope. One by one, he released the giants. They stood up, stretched their stiffened limbs, and started leaping about in fury.
Why ain't they putting us down here with this grub-sledging hole?
They shouted at the BFG.
Because you is guzzling human beings,
The BFG answered.
In that case,
The flesh lump eater bellowed.
I think we is guzzling you instead.
The BFG grabbed the dangling rope and was hoisted out of the pit just in time. The great bulging sack he had brought back with him from the giant country lay at the top of the pit. "What's in there?" the Queen asked. The BFG pulled out a gigantic black and white striped object the size of a man.
Snozcumbers. This is the repulsant Snozcumber, Magister, and that is all we is going to give these disgustive giants from now on.
"May I taste it?" the Queen asked.
Don't, Magister, don't. It is tasting of trog filth and pig squibble.
With that, he tossed the Snozcumber down to the giants below.
There's your supper,
he shouted. He fished out more Snozcumbers from the sack and threw them down. The giants below howled and cursed. The BFG laughed.
It serves them right, left, and centre.
"What will we feed them on when the Snozcumbers are all used up?" the Queen asked him.
Oh, they is never being used up, Magister,
the BFG answered, smiling.
I is also bringing in this sack a whole bungle of Snozcumber plants, which I is giving, with your permission, to the royal gardener to put in the soil. Then we is having an everlasting supply of this repulsant food to feed these thirst-bloody giants on.
"What a clever fellow you are," the Queen said. Every country in the world that had in the past been visited by the foul, man-eating giants sent telegrams of congratulations and thanks to the BFG and to Sophie. Kings and presidents and prime ministers and rulers of every kind showered the enormous giant and the little girl with compliments and thank yous, as well as all sorts of medals and presents. The Queen gave orders that a special house with tremendous high ceilings and enormous doors should immediately be built in Windsor Great Park, next to her own castle, for the BFG to live in, and a pretty little cottage was put up next door for Sophie. The BFG's house was to have a special dream-storing room with hundreds of shelves in it. What is more, he was given the title of the Royal Dream Blower. He was allowed to go galloping off to any place in England on any night of the year to blow his splendid fizz-whizzers in through the windows to sleeping children. And letters poured into his house by the million from children begging him to pay them a visit. Meanwhile, tourists from all over the world came flocking to gaze down in wonder at the 9 horrendous man-eating giants in the great pit. They came especially at feeding time, when the Snozcumbers were being thrown down by the keeper, and it was a pleasure to listen to the howls and growls coming up from the pit as the giants began to chew upon the filthiest-tasting vegetable on earth. The BFG expressed a wish to learn how to speak properly, and Sophie herself, who loved him as she would a father, volunteered to give him lessons every day. She even taught him how to spell and to write sentences, and he turned out to be a splendid, intelligent pupil. In his spare time, he read books. He became a tremendous reader. He read all of Charles Dickens, whom he no longer called Dahl's chickens, and all of Shakespeare, and literally thousands of other books. He also started to write essays about his own past life. When Sophie read some of them, she said, "These are very good. I think perhaps one day you could become a real writer."
Oh, I would love that. Do you think I could?
I know you could. Why don't you start by writing a book about you and me?
Very well. I'll give it a try.
So he did. He worked hard on it, and in the end he completed it. Rather shyly, he showed it to the Queen. The Queen read it aloud to her grandchildren. Then the Queen said,
"I think we ought to get this book printed properly and published so that other children can read it."
This was arranged. But because the BFG was a very modest giant, he wouldn't put his own name on it. He used somebody else's name instead. But where, you might ask, is this book that the BFG wrote? It's right here. I've just finished reading it to you.